My name is Kendra. I am 35 years old. When my apartment burned down in the middle of the night, I stood shivering on the sidewalk and called my parents for help. My mother simply sighed and told me it was not their problem, adding that I should have been more careful with my cheap candles. She hung up, leaving me in the freezing cold. Then the fire investigator approached me with an evidence bag. He asked if I knew who had access to my place last week, because they found something at the scene. What he showed me made my blood run absolutely cold. Before I tell you how a single phone call led me to dismantle my family's entire empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own safety net because your family refused to catch you. The biting chill of the Chicago wind whipped off Lake Michigan, cutting straight through my thin silk robe, but I barely felt it. I was too busy tasting the bitter ash that rained down on the sidewalk. Across the street, the historic Bronzeville brownstone I called home was completely engulfed in flashing red and blue lights. The piercing shriek of fire engines filled the neighborhood, drowning out the frantic murmurs of the neighbors who had gathered on their porches wrapped in thick blankets. I stood perfectly still behind the yellow police tape, my eyes locked on the third floor. It was not the entire building that was burning. The flames were viciously, specifically eating through the mahogany window frames of my home office. A sudden violent crack echoed through the street as the large bay window blew out, sending a shower of glowing orange glass raining down onto the pavement below. The heat washed over my face, carrying with it the sickening smell of burning paper and melting plastic. Everything in that room, my computers, my files, my secure servers, was turning to charcoal. With trembling fingers, I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen. I did what any daughter would do in a moment of sheer terror. I dialed my mother. The phone rang 3 times, each ring feeling like an eternity in the freezing night air. When the line finally clicked open, there was no panicked greeting, no frantic question asking if I was safe. Instead, a sharp, irritated sigh filtered through the receiver. "Kendra, it is 2 in the morning!" My mother Vivian snapped, her voice thick with annoyance rather than sleep. I could hear the rustle of high thread count sheets in the background. "Mom," I gasped, choking on the smoke lingering in my throat. "My building is on fire. My office is completely gone. I am out on the street." I waited for the gasp. I waited for the maternal instinct to kick in, for her to tell me she and my father Roland were getting in the car to come get me. Instead, Vivian clicked her tongue, a sound of profound inconvenience. "Kendra, please do not be dramatic right now," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Jasmine and Trent have a massive investor brunch at the country club tomorrow morning. It is a crucial networking event for Trent's new startup, and your father and I need our sleep if we are going to host properly. You always were so careless with your things. I told you those cheap candles you buy would cause a disaster one day." The sheer callousness of her words hit me harder than the freezing wind. "Mom, I have nothing but the clothes on my back right now," I pleaded, trying to keep my voice from shattering. "I just need a place to stay for the night." I heard my father muttering something in the background, followed by my mother's exasperated huff. "Figure it out, Kendra," she replied coldly. "Book a cheap motel or call a friend. We have a huge day tomorrow for your sister, and we cannot afford to be dragged down by your carelessness. We are not an ATM for your mistakes." Before I could say another word, the line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone, staring at the darkened screen. The dial tone echoed in my ears, finalizing the absolute emotional abandonment I had just experienced. I did not cry. I had stopped crying over Vivian and Roland's blatant favoritism years ago. I simply stood there on the ash-covered sidewalk and let the reality of my family dynamic wash over me. They truly believed I was a struggling freelance bookkeeper renting a cheap, drafty flat in the city. They thought I was scraping by, barely making ends meet, a convenient foil to make my younger sister Jasmine look like a shining star. They had spent their entire lives pouring every ounce of their love, attention, and financial resources into Jasmine. They paid her expensive private college tuition, funded her lavish wedding to Trent, and repeatedly bailed out Trent's arrogant failing business ventures. Meanwhile, I was the daughter they constantly reminded to be realistic. They had no idea who I really was. As I watched the firefighters douse the last of the flames in my office, I did not panic about losing my home. I opened my banking app, completely bypassing my modest checking account, and logged into my secure, encrypted offshore portfolio. The numbers on the screen proved what my family would never fathom. I did not rent this historic Bronzeville brownstone. I owned the entire $2.5 million building in cash. I was not a struggling bookkeeper taking on odd jobs. I was a ruthless, highly successful venture capitalist managing a multi-million-dollar private equity firm from the very room that was currently burning to ash. I had spent a decade building an empire in the shadows, creating an impenetrable safety net, because I learned early on that my family would never catch me if I fell. They thought they were turning away a desperate daughter looking for a handout. They had no idea they had just hung up on the woman who secretly funded the very industry Trent was desperately trying to break into. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, the cold logic of survival completely replacing my initial shock. I was already calculating the insurance claims, the server backups, and the cost of temporary housing, but my mental arithmetic was abruptly interrupted. A tall, broad-shouldered man ducked under the yellow police tape and walked purposefully toward me. He wore a heavy fire investigator jacket over his suit, his face grim and illuminated by the strobe of the emergency lights. "Miss," he said, his voice low and serious, "I am Detective Sterling. I am the lead investigator for this district. Are you the sole occupant of the third-floor unit?" I nodded, pulling my robe tighter around my shivering shoulders. "Yes, that is my apartment." Sterling did not offer a comforting smile. He gestured for me to step away from the crowd of onlookers, guiding me toward the side of his command vehicle. "Miss, you need to see this," he said, his tone shifting into something strictly professional and entirely ominous. "We just finished the initial sweep of the room where the fire originated. We found the ignition point." He reached into his deep pocket and pulled out something that made my breath completely stop. The biting wind whipped my silk robe around my legs, but the cold barely registered. My mind was entirely consumed by the grim set of his jaw and the sharp, assessing way his eyes darted over me. Sterling unlocked the rear doors of his truck, the interior bathed in harsh, clinical white light. He pulled out a metal clipboard and leaned against the bumper, crossing his arms over his thick canvas jacket. He studied me for a long, calculating moment before he spoke. He told me plainly that fires do not behave the way my office just did. He explained that flames naturally want to climb, seeking oxygen, and upward drafts spreading across ceilings and consuming drywall. But the blaze in my third-floor office had burned with a bizarre, concentrated intensity directly into the floorboards. It was a localized inferno, burning so fiercely and so unnaturally hot that it had blown the windows out rather than spreading to the adjacent hallway. He leaned in closer, and I could smell the sharp chemical odor clinging to his uniform. He said it smelled like premium camp fuel, an accelerant poured deliberately and generously over a very specific 4-foot radius in the center of the room. This was not a knocked-over candle. This was not faulty wiring. Someone had walked into my home, bypassed the alarm, stood in the middle of my workspace, and intentionally set it ablaze. Sterling unclipped a pen and asked me a simple, terrifying question. He asked who else had a key to the heavy reinforced door of my unit. I hesitated. The streetlights flashed red and blue across my face as my mind raced through the impossibilities. I lived alone. My building manager did not have access to my private floor. The only other person on earth who possessed a physical key was my mother, Vivian. I had given it to her 3 years ago, during a rare moment of familial optimism, telling her it was strictly for absolute emergencies. She had scoffed at the time, tossing it carelessly into her designer handbag, complaining that she would never need to visit my depressing little apartment anyway. But Vivian lived in a sprawling estate with Roland, Jasmine, and Trent. That key hung on a brass hook in their mudroom, accessible to anyone in that house. I bit the inside of my cheek, refusing to name my family out loud just yet. I told Sterling I needed a moment to think, masking my rising suspicion behind the guise of shock. I did not want to point fingers at my own blood without proof. Sterling saw my hesitation. He knew I was holding something back. He reached into the deep pocket of his jacket and pulled out a heavy-duty clear plastic evidence bag. He held it up by the corners, letting it catch the harsh overhead light of the command truck. Inside the bag sat a silver Zippo lighter. It was partially blackened by soot, the metal warped and blistered on one side from the intense heat of the blaze. But the front-facing plate was still perfectly intact. My blood turned to absolute ice. The air seized in my lungs, and the street around me seemed to drop into total silence. It was not a generic lighter. It was custom engraved. I knew the weight of it, the exact polished finish of the sterling silver, the precise depth of the lettering etched into the metal casing. I recognized the stylized monogram reading TRW because I was the one who had paid a master engraver to carve those letters. It was the exact lighter I had purchased for my white brother-in-law Trent for his 30th birthday. I had bought it back when I still desperately tried to buy my way into my family's good graces, back when I thought a luxury gift might make them look at me with an ounce of respect. I remembered that birthday dinner at the high-end downtown steakhouse perfectly. Trent had opened the box, sneered at the thoughtful gift, and loudly joked that it was probably a cheap knockoff considering my pathetic accountant salary. Yet despite his mockery, his massive ego could not resist the customized monogram. From that night onward, he carried it everywhere. He used it constantly, dramatically, flipping it open to light his cigars at country club mixers, boasting to his wealthy friends about his sophisticated tastes. He bragged endlessly that he never left home without it. And here it was sealed in a police evidence bag recovered from the charred ruins of my home office. The pieces snapped together in my mind with terrifying speed. Trent. Trent had been in my apartment. Trent had bypassed my security, stood in my private sanctuary, and struck the flint of his own birthday present to ignite the accelerant. But the realization made absolutely no logical sense. Trent hated me, yes. He viewed me as a broke, pathetic loser who stained his pristine high society marriage to my golden child sister. But Trent was also profoundly lazy and aggressively arrogant. He considered himself a titan of industry, a tech visionary on the verge of a billion-dollar breakthrough, despite the reality that his startup was bleeding cash and entirely propped up by my parents' drained retirement accounts. He had no reason to risk a felony arson charge just to burn the cheap apartment of a sister-in-law he thoroughly despised. There was no financial gain for him here. He thought I had nothing worth stealing, unless he found out that I did. Sterling watched my face drain of color. He asked me if I recognized the item. I forced my voice to remain completely steady, burying the volcanic rage building in my chest. I told him I needed to see the schematics of the room before I answered any questions. Sterling frowned, clearly frustrated by my evasion, but he flipped the pages on his metal clipboard. He pulled up the structural blueprint of my third-floor unit, a document he had pulled from city records when the fire call came in. He tapped his pen against the center of my office layout, circling the exact focal point where the flames had burned the hottest and deepest. I stared at the blueprint, my eyes tracking the coordinates his pen outlined. He was pointing to a spot exactly 4 feet from the southern load-bearing wall and 3 feet from the mahogany bookshelves. A second, infinitely more terrifying realization hit me, hitting with such force that I actually had to grip the side of the command vehicle to remain standing. That precise location was not just an empty patch of hardwood floor. It was the exact spot where a custom-built titanium-reinforced floor safe was bolted directly into the steel joists of the building. My family thought I was a struggling freelancer. They did not know that bolted beneath those floorboards was a vault containing physical property deeds, untraceable bearer bonds, and a cold storage hardware wallet holding tens of millions of dollars in cryptocurrency. It was the absolute core of my financial empire, the key to every shell company I operated. My voice dropped to a razor-sharp whisper. "Detective, did your men find a heavy steel box in the debris right there at that ignition point?" Sterling stopped tapping his pen. His professional detachment slipped, replaced by a dark, knowing grimace. He shook his head slowly, looking me dead in the eye. "No, Miss Wilson. There was no steel box in the ashes. The floorboards in that exact spot were not just burned through. They were mechanically sawed open with power tools. The joists were stripped bare. Whatever was hidden inside the floor was expertly extracted and taken entirely off the premises long before the first drop of accelerant was ever poured." Sterling reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder harness, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. He was ready to dispatch a squad to Trent's doorstep right that second. I grabbed his thick canvas sleeve, my fingers digging fiercely into the rough fabric. "Do not make that call," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, razor-sharp whisper. Sterling looked at me like I had completely lost my mind. He pointed a gloved finger toward the smoking, shattered ruins of my third-floor window. "Miss Wilson, that is grand larceny and felony arson. Whoever did this just tried to burn a historic residential building to the ground to cover up a robbery. I am sending a unit to pick up your brother-in-law before he has the time to destroy whatever he stole. If you send a squad car to my parents' house right now, Trent will immediately play the victim." I fired back, my mind operating 10 steps ahead of his police protocol. My mother will drain her entire retirement account to hire the most ruthless defense attorney in Chicago before the sun even comes up. They will claim the lighter was stolen. They will claim the evidence is purely circumstantial. He will post bail within hours, and the very first thing he will do is panic and destroy what he took from that floor safe. I cannot let that happen. I need to know exactly what he is trying to do with my property. Sterling frowned, studying my face in the chaotic flashing emergency lights. He saw no hysteria, no weeping, only cold, calculated rage. "You are playing an incredibly dangerous game here. If he destroys the evidence while you sit around waiting, you lose everything." "I will not lose anything," I replied, stepping back and pulling my ruined silk robe tighter over my chest. "Give me 3 hours, detective. Just 3 hours. I will hand you his motive, his method, and his absolute confession on a silver platter." I did not wait for his agreement. I turned on my heel and walked rapidly away from the burning shell of my home, ignoring the paramedics who tried to drape a shock blanket over my shoulders. My car was parked 2 blocks away, safely untouched by the drifting ash and debris. I slid into the driver's seat, the sharp smell of smoke deeply clinging to my hair, and slammed my foot on the gas. 10 minutes later, I pushed through the glass doors of a 24-hour diner on the edge of the South Loop. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed aggressively overhead, illuminating cracked leather booths and sticky formica tables. A tired waitress holding a pot of burnt coffee gave my soot-stained clothes a highly suspicious look, but I tossed a crisp $50 bill onto the counter and walked straight to a booth in the darkest, most isolated corner of the restaurant. I opened my heavy-duty encrypted laptop. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the fake freelance bookkeeping interface I actively used as a daily decoy. I entered a complex series of biometric prompts and instantly accessed the highly secure offshore servers where my actual life existed. My family genuinely believed I was barely scraping by, balancing simple ledgers for local bakeries and corner stores. They believed this because I explicitly and carefully designed it that way. 6 years ago, when I successfully secured my first major venture capital buyout, my mother Vivian had the absolute audacity to demand I hand over my profit to fully fund Jasmine's new luxury lifestyle brand. Vivian had cornered me in her pristine marble-countered kitchen, sipping a mimosa and waving a perfectly manicured hand at my worn sneakers. "You are just a freelance accountant," Kendra Vivian had scoffed with deep disdain. "You do not need that kind of capital sitting around doing nothing. Jasmine is building an empire. She needs the seed money to secure a premium storefront in the Gold Coast. You should be grateful and happy to invest in your own sister." I had laughed directly in her face. I sharply reminded Vivian that I paid my own way through Howard University by grinding 80-hour work weeks, skipping meals, and fighting aggressively for every academic scholarship available. Meanwhile, she and Roland happily dropped hundreds of thousands of dollars on Jasmine's Spelman tuition, only to blindly watch her drop out and then bailed out her 2 previously collapsed high-end boutiques without a second thought. Vivian had slapped my face that day, screaming that I was a bitter, jealous failure who would never understand true Black excellence. That was the exact moment I completely stopped sharing my reality with them. I let them think I was broke. I let them think I was a loser. It was the ultimate necessary camouflage. But right now, that flawless camouflage was actively working against me. Trent thought he was stealing from a low-level accountant who happened to hoard some decent vintage jewelry. He had absolutely no idea what was actually hidden inside that titanium floor safe. I pulled up the secure digital ledger for my cold storage hardware wallet. The physical device was a piece of military-grade tech no larger than a standard flash drive, but it fundamentally held the keys to my entire kingdom. Inside that heavily encrypted drive sat tens of millions in untraceable cryptocurrency, strictly alongside the digital deeds and administrative access codes to three of my most lucrative shell companies. My stomach twisted into a tight, agonizing knot. The drive required a specific biometric thumbprint and a highly randomized 12-word seed phrase to unlock. But Trent arrogantly fancied himself a tech visionary. He constantly bragged about his elite coding skills at family dinners, completely ignoring the reality that his startup was failing spectacularly. If he somehow realized what the device actually was, he might foolishly attempt to force a brute force decryption. If he entered the wrong sequence too many times, the drive was aggressively programmed to permanently wipe itself clean. He could literally evaporate my liquid empire before breakfast. "Come on, you arrogant fool," I muttered to the glowing screen, my eyes rapidly scanning complex lines of code. "Do not try to be a genius tonight." The waitress walked over hesitantly, pushing a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee onto my table. She asked if I needed an ambulance because I smelled like a massive bonfire. I waved her off instantly, without breaking eye contact with my terminal. I needed a signal. I had previously built a silent, highly sensitive distress beacon directly into the core firmware of the hardware wallet. If the device was plugged into any unverified network or an unauthorized computer port, it would immediately execute a hidden background protocol and aggressively ping my private server with its exact geographical location. I sat in the dim, greasy diner, ignoring the scalding coffee, intensely watching the digital nodes on my screen pulse in a steady, maddening rhythm. The minutes dragged like physical weights. The ambient clatter of the diner completely faded away. I ran a secondary trace program, fully preparing to execute a total lockdown on the shell company accounts just in case Trent actually managed to somehow bypass the primary firewall. Suddenly, my phone vibrated violently against the sticky Formica table. A high-priority security alert flashed across my laptop screen, painting my face in a harsh, glaring red glow. The distress beacon had triggered. The hardware wallet had just been plugged into an active USB port. I immediately initiated the trace protocol, my fingers moving frantically and flawlessly over the keys. The firewall instantly caught the unauthorized intrusion, successfully locking the internal files, but the device's location tracker was already broadcasting loud and clear. A detailed map generated on my screen, a small red dot aggressively expanding and contracting as it rapidly narrowed down the active signal. The IP address pinged a local high-tier residential service provider. The map zoomed in on the greater Chicago area, sweeping past the dense city limits, rushing straight toward the affluent, manicured western suburbs. The red dot locked firmly into place. I stared at the screen, a chilling, deeply satisfied smile slowly creeping across my face. The signal was not coming from Trent's cheap rented downtown office. It was not coming from a shady pawn shop or a desperate black market fence. The dot was blinking directly over the exclusive, highly secured, gated community in Oakbrook. It was pinpointed exactly on Roland and Vivian's massive 6-bedroom estate. Trent was at my parents' house, sitting safely under their roof, attempting to crack my stolen safe while they slept. 3 days later, I pulled my beat-up sedan into the sweeping circular driveway of my parents' Oakbrook estate. The towering white pillars and perfectly manicured lawns screamed of the status they so desperately clung to. I had deliberately chosen not to wash the soot out of my hair or scrub the stubborn ash from under my fingernails. I wore the same smoke-ruined jacket from the night of the fire, pairing it with cheap scuffed jeans. I needed to look exactly like the broken, destitute daughter they had always imagined me to be. I needed them to drop their guards completely. The heavy oak front door was unlocked, a testament to the arrogant safety they felt in their gated community. I pushed it open. The familiar scent of Vivian's expensive lavender diffusers clashed violently with the stale smoke clinging to my clothes. From the formal dining room, the clinking of crystal and loud, boastful laughter echoed through the high-ceilinged foyer. Sunday dinner was in full swing. I stepped into the dining room doorway and stood in silence, observing the scene. The mahogany table was groaning under the weight of a massive prime rib, roasted vegetables, and silver platters. Roland sat at the head of the table, a heavy carving knife in one hand and a glass of expensive bourbon in the other. A gold Rolex flashed on his wrist. He stopped mid-slice when he saw me. The laughter died instantly. "Look who decided to show up looking for a handout," Roland scoffed, dropping the carving knife onto the silver platter with a loud clatter. His eyes swept over my ruined jacket with pure disgust. "I thought your mother told you to figure it out, Kendra. We are not running a charity operation here. You are 35 years old. It is incredibly embarrassing that you still cannot manage your own life." I kept my shoulders slumped and forced my voice to tremble. "I lost everything, Dad. My apartment is completely gone. I do not even have my work laptop to log my bookkeeping hours." Jasmine let out a sharp, irritated sigh from across the table. She adjusted her emerald silk dress and glared at my shoes. "Kendra, please do not track ash on the Persian rug. Trent just got the rugs professionally cleaned to celebrate his big news. Have some respect for our home. We cannot have the place smelling like a campfire." I looked at my younger sister. She was 32 years old and had never worked a hard day in her life. Beside her sat Trent, swirling wine in his glass with a smug, self-satisfied grin. Neither of them asked if I was hurt. Neither of them asked how I managed to escape a burning building in the middle of the night. Their only concern was the cleanliness of a rug bought with my parents' money. Trent leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, Kendra, timing is everything. We are celebrating a massive victory today. A little fire at your rental unit is unfortunate, but you really should have called before crashing our dinner. We have investors to impress this week, and we cannot have this kind of negative energy dragging down the vibe. You know how important optics are in the venture capital world." I dug my fingernails into my palms to stop myself from reaching across the table and strangling him. This was the man who had sawed open my floorboards, stolen millions in digital currency, and set my home ablaze. Now he was sitting at my family table eating their food and lecturing me about negative energy. I swallowed the burning rage and played my part flawlessly. "I am sorry," I whispered, staring at my scuffed shoes. "I just did not know where else to go. The insurance company says it will take weeks to process the claim because of the arson investigation. I literally have nowhere to sleep tonight." Vivian finally spoke up from the opposite end of the table. She delicately wiped her mouth with a linen napkin and gave me a look of profound exhaustion. "Arson. See, this is exactly what happens when you rent in those cheap, ungentrified neighborhoods, Kendra. You attract criminal elements. I warned you about this years ago when you refused to let us help you find a proper place. You always insist on doing things the hard way." "You never offered to help me find a place, Mom," I said, keeping my tone perfectly submissive. "You told me I had to earn my own way while you paid the down payment on Jasmine and Trent's house." "Do not start with the jealousy routine today," Roland barked, pointing a finger at me. "Your sister and her husband are building a legacy. Trent is a visionary. You chose to be a freelance bookkeeper tracking pennies for local bakeries, and these are the consequences of living paycheck to paycheck. You have zero safety net. That is your own fault. We will not reward your lack of ambition." I forced tears to well up in my eyes. "I know, you are right. I should have planned better. But right now, I just need a roof over my head. Can I please stay in my old childhood room for a few days, just until I figure out a rental situation?" Vivian slammed her crystal water glass down on the table, the liquid splashing over the rim. "Absolutely not," she snapped, her voice sharp and final. "Trent uses that room as his meditation space now. He needs absolute quiet and zero distractions for his daily visualization exercises." We cannot disrupt his creative process when he is on the verge of a multi-million-dollar breakthrough. I stared at my mother, letting the sheer absurdity of her statement wash over me. I was her flesh and blood standing before her, smelling of smoke and ash, explicitly stating I was homeless. And she was prioritizing an arrogant white man's meditation space over my basic survival. Trent did not even have the grace to look embarrassed. He simply took another bite of his prime rib, chewing slowly, completely validating his own absurd entitlement. It is true, Kendra Trent said, waving his fork in the air. High-level tech development requires a pristine mental environment. Having someone sleeping in my zone, especially someone radiating your kind of desperation, would completely throw off my frequency. You understand, right? Business is business. I nodded slowly, letting the tears spill over my eyelashes. I understand. I will just go to a homeless shelter downtown. I am sure they have a bed available tonight. I turned to leave, deliberately dragging my feet, waiting for the trap I knew was coming. I knew Jasmine could not resist an opportunity to exert absolute power over me. She lived for these moments. The chance to humiliate me was the only currency she truly valued. Hold on, Jasmine called out, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Do not be so dramatic, Kendra. A shelter is completely unnecessary. We are family after all. I actually have an offer for you. Jasmine folded her hands delicately on the edge of the mahogany table, her diamond engagement ring catching the light from the chandelier. She looked at me with the exact same expression she used when stepping over a puddle in her designer heels. It was a look of pure, unadulterated pity mixed with profound disgust. We have that old velvet sofa down in the unfinished section of the basement, Jasmine said, her voice bright and sickeningly charitable. It is a bit damp down there, and the golden retriever uses it as a bed when he sneaks downstairs, so you might need to check it for fleas. But it is shelter, and frankly, Kendra beggars cannot be choosers. I stood there in my soot-stained jacket, staring at the sister who had been handed the world on a silver platter, offering me a flea-ridden dog bed in a concrete cellar. But naturally, there is a condition. Jasmine continued, picking up her wineglass and taking a slow, dramatic sip. Our live-in nanny just quit yesterday, completely walked out on us without notice because she claimed the twins were too difficult. It has been an absolute nightmare for my mental health. So if you want to sleep in our basement and eat our food, you are going to earn your keep. You will take over the childcare completely. You will wake up at 5 in the morning, prepare their organic meals, drive them to their private academy, pick them up, manage their tutors, and handle the daily household cleaning. Roland nodded in stern agreement, aggressively slicing another thick piece of prime rib. That is a highly generous offer, Kendra. Honest, hard labor will build your character. You should thank your sister for giving you a sense of purpose. I need you entirely focused on the house, Jasmine added, waving her fork in my direction. Trent is going through a massive professional transition right now. We are talking billionaire status very soon. As his wife, my primary job is to support his new lifestyle, which means I cannot be bogged down with laundry or screaming children. You will be my unpaid assistant until you can afford a security deposit on a new apartment, assuming you ever save up that kind of money. I dug my nails so deeply into my palms that the skin nearly broke. The absolute audacity of her offer burned through my veins like acid. I looked at Jasmine, wrapped in expensive silk, acting like a benevolent queen bestowing grace upon a peasant. My mind instantly flashed back to the day of my high school graduation. I had spent 4 grueling years working weekend shifts at a local diner, saving every single dollar I earned in a locked tin box on my desk. I had saved exactly $5,000 money I desperately needed to pay for my textbooks and a cheap laptop for my freshman year at Howard University. I had come home from my final shift the week before leaving for college to find my lockbox pried open and completely empty. I had panicked. I had torn my room apart. Then I had walked into the living room and found Jasmine proudly modeling a limited edition vintage Chanel handbag in front of the hallway mirror. When I started screaming, demanding my money back, Vivian and Roland had immediately rushed to Jasmine's defense. They pulled me aside and scolded me for causing a scene. They told me Jasmine had simply borrowed the funds because she needed a statement piece for her upcoming sorority rush week. They told me not to be so stingy and selfish with my own flesh and blood. They promised she would pay me back eventually. She never gave me a single dime. That was the sister currently offering me a damp basement sofa in exchange for indentured servitude. I forced my facial muscles to relax. I let my shoulders drop further, adopting the posture of a thoroughly defeated, desperate woman who had no other options left in the world. I looked up at Jasmine and manufactured a weak, trembling smile. "Thank you, Jasmine," I whispered, making my voice sound appropriately thick with manufactured gratitude. "You have no idea how much this means to me. I will do whatever you need. I will take care of the kids and the house. I just need a safe place to sleep." Vivian sighed heavily, finally satisfied that I had properly submitted to the family hierarchy. "We'll see that you do, Kendra. Keep out of our way, do your chores quietly, and try not to spread your negative energy to the children." I nodded meekly, keeping my eyes fixed on the Persian rug. But my brain was already shifting gears, calculating my next move. Trent was sitting there chewing his steak, practically vibrating with unearned arrogance. I needed him talking. I needed him to drop a thread I could follow back to my stolen server. "Billionaire status," I said, shifting my gaze to Trent and widening my eyes in feigned awe. "Trent, that is absolutely incredible. The last time we spoke at Thanksgiving, you mentioned the startup was struggling to secure Series A funding. How did you manage to turn the entire company around so fast? That takes absolute genius." Trent swallowed his food heavily and puffed out his chest completely, unable to resist the opportunity to brag about his own manufactured brilliance. He leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, looking at me with intense condescension. "The market simply needed time to catch up to my vision," Kendra, Trent said smoothly, adopting the practiced cadence of a Silicon Valley fraud. "You wouldn't understand the complex mechanics of high-level venture capital. But the reality is that my underlying algorithm was always flawless. It just required the right institutional backing to properly scale." I kept my face perfectly blank, projecting nothing but sisterly admiration. "But where did the capital come from?" I asked innocently. "I thought the banks had frozen your commercial lines of credit." Roland shot me a warning glare, but Trent held up a hand, eager to hear himself speak. "It is fine, Roland. Let her learn how real business is conducted." Trent turned his arrogant smirk back to me. "The banks lack vision. They rely on outdated metrics. I bypassed them entirely. Last week, I secured a massive injection of stealth capital from a silent angel investor." "A silent angel investor," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "Exactly," Trent boasted. "An offshore entity operating through a highly secure, decentralized trust. They reached out to me directly. They recognized the disruptive potential of my tech and offered to completely buy out the company's debt and inject tens of millions in liquid capital to take us global. We are finalizing the asset transfer protocols this week. It is a completely anonymous, crypto-based liquidity event." The cold, hard truth slammed into my mind with breathtaking clarity. Trent was not just a thief. He was attempting an incredibly sloppy, high-stakes money laundering operation. He had stolen my physical hardware wallet, but he had not cracked the encryption himself. He had somehow found a way to use the very existence of those stolen digital bearer bonds and cryptocurrency wallets as leverage. He was planning to inject my stolen, untraceable offshore funds directly into his failing, worthless startup, disguising the theft as a legitimate corporate buyout from a fictional angel investor. He was going to use my money to make himself a billionaire, completely washing the stolen assets through his own company ledger. It was brazen, it was desperate, and it was going to destroy him. "That is truly inspiring, Trent," I said, keeping my voice soft and deferential. "You really proved everyone wrong." Jasmine let out a high-pitched, triumphant laugh. She reached for her crystal wineglass, her eyes shining with absolute greed. "We are entering an entirely new tax bracket, Kendra," she gloated. "We are finally getting the respect and the lifestyle we have always deserved. You can go ahead and take your bags down to the basement. I will leave a list of chores on the kitchen island for you to start on tomorrow morning." As Jasmine reached across the table, the long emerald silk sleeve of her designer dress slipped backward down her arm. The light from the massive crystal chandelier above the dining table caught her wrist, sending a blinding fractured prism of brilliant white light directly into my eyes. I stopped breathing. The entire room seemed to drop into a sudden vacuum-sealed silence. Clinging to Jasmine's wrist was a thick, heavy band of platinum and diamonds. It was a vintage Cartier tennis bracelet specifically custom set with alternating internally flawless emerald-cut diamonds and rare cashmere sapphires. It was a unique one-of-a-kind piece of jewelry that had been privately auctioned in Geneva 4 years ago. I knew every single microscopic detail of that bracelet. I knew the exact weight of the platinum. I knew the specific clarity of the center sapphire. I knew this because I was the anonymous buyer who had won that auction. That vintage Cartier bracelet was not a family heirloom. It was not a gift from Trent. It was the exact piece of jewelry I kept securely locked inside a velvet-lined drawer within the titanium floor safe of my Bronzeville office. The same safe Trent had sawed out of my floorboards before setting my apartment on fire. My sister was casually wearing my stolen property to Sunday dinner. I stared at the sparkling diamonds resting against her skin. The urge to lunge across the table, grab her by the throat, and rip the platinum off her wrist was so violently overwhelming that my vision actually blurred. But I forced my hands to remain perfectly still by my sides. I forced my breathing to slow. If they wanted to play games with my wealth, I would gladly play. They had invited the wolf directly into their home, handed her the keys to the castle, and politely asked her to clean the floors. I looked up at Jasmine, my face breaking into a wide, perfectly subservient smile. "That is a beautiful bracelet, Jasmine," I said softly. Jasmine admired her wrist, twisting her arm so the diamonds caught the light again. "Trent bought it for me to celebrate the buyout," she preened. "He has such incredible taste." "I will get my bags," I replied, turning away from the table before they could see the lethal, calculated murder in my eyes. "I will start on those chores right away." I had just promised to start on those chores right away, turning toward the hallway, but my feet felt permanently bolted to the hardwood floor. The blinding, fractured light from the Cartier bracelet held me completely captive. I could not simply walk away. I needed to hear her say it out loud. I needed to document the exact depth of their delusion and their absolute lack of caution. I paused, letting my heavy, soot-stained duffel bag drop an inch, and turned back toward the dining table. I pointed a dirty, trembling finger directly at her wrist. "Those are beautiful diamonds, Jasmine," I said, forcing a tone of breathless, pathetic envy into my voice. "Where did you get that?" Jasmine smirked, clearly thrilled that I had noticed her shiny new toy. She ran her perfectly manicured fingers over the platinum setting, ensuring the internally flawless stones caught the maximum amount of light from the chandelier overhead. She leaned over and patted Trent's hand with exaggerated performative affection. "Trent bought it for me to celebrate his new funding," Jasmine boasted, her voice echoing loudly in the large room. "He has amazing taste, unlike some people. It is a vintage piece, entirely custom. You literally cannot find this in stores." "Only the best for my wife," Trent added, puffing out his chest and adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt. He looked at me with an expression of profound pity. "You have to understand, Kendra, when you operate at my level, you acquire an eye for true, unadulterated luxury. It is not something you can find at a local mall. It takes connections. It takes serious capital." I smiled, walking slowly over to the crystal pitcher on the sideboard and pouring myself a glass of ice water. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The icy liquid sliding down my throat perfectly matched the temperature of my blood. Trent had not just burned my historic brownstone to cover his tracks. He had systematically looted my personal vault to adorn his spoiled wife and fund his completely fictional tech empire. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of handing Jasmine a stolen, highly identifiable $1 million piece of vintage jewelry was almost comical. It proved exactly how untouchable he believed he was. He genuinely thought I was a nobody. He thought there would be zero consequences. "It is truly stunning," I murmured softly, setting the glass down. "You are a very lucky woman, Jasmine." They both laughed at my expense, a sharp, unified sound of superiority. Roland joined in shaking his head at my apparent awe of their wealth, while Vivian told me to stop staring and get my bags downstairs before I ruined the ambiance of their celebration. I carried my duffel bag down the narrow wooden stairs into the unfinished section of the basement. The air down here was thick, damp, and smelled aggressively of mildew and wet dog. The velvet sofa Jasmine had so graciously offered me was shoved into a dark corner next to the humming water heater. It was covered in golden retriever hair and suspicious stains. It was exactly as repulsive as she had described. But I did not care about the damp air or the filthy cushions. I tossed my bag onto the concrete floor and immediately pulled out my encrypted laptop. I sat cross-legged in the dark, using my phone as a secure mobile hotspot, and initiated a deeply encrypted VPN connection. I bypassed my fake bookkeeping interface and logged directly into my corporate communication network. I needed to contact Elijah. Elijah was my lead corporate attorney and the ruthless architect of my offshore financial shields. He was a man who charged $2,000 an hour to make multinational corporate problems completely disappear. I sent an emergency priority ping to his secure server. Within 30 seconds, his icon flashed green. I typed rapidly in the chat window, explaining the situation without any emotional embellishment. I told him a hostile domestic actor currently possessed my primary hardware wallet and was actively attempting to utilize the assets to fund a local venture capital acquisition. Elijah's response was immediate and incredibly sharp. He reminded me that the hardware wallet was protected by military-grade multi-signature requirements. Trent could not simply walk into a Chase Bank branch and deposit $30 million in bearer bonds and cryptocurrency. The sheer volume of the assets combined with the complex smart contracts I had embedded in the code meant the funds were completely locked down. Trent was holding a digital gold mine, but he had absolutely no shovel. To liquidate those assets, Trent would need a highly specialized backdoor. He would need a shadow broker. I smiled in the dark basement, the blue light of the screen illuminating my face. That was exactly what I was counting on. I typed my instructions to Elijah. I told him to deploy our network resources and quietly set up a digital trap. We needed to create a phantom brokerage firm on the dark web, an entity that specifically catered to desperate high-net-worth individuals looking to rapidly and anonymously liquidate massive crypto holdings without passing through federal regulatory checks. If Trent was trying to finalize his fake buyout by the end of the week, he would be frantically searching the dark web for a broker exactly like the one we were about to invent. I closed the laptop, hid it securely inside the ripped lining of my duffel bag, and finally lay down on the damp, flea-ridden sofa. For the first time since my apartment went up in flames, I slept perfectly. The next 3 days were a masterclass in psychological endurance and calculated humiliation. I played the role of the broken, destitute nanny flawlessly. I woke up every morning at 5 o'clock. I stood in my mother's massive, pristine kitchen and cooked organic oatmeal for Jasmine's 6-year-old twins. The children were holy terrors. They screamed through their expensive wooden toys at my head and deliberately spilled juice on the hardwood floors because they knew their mother would blame me for the mess. Jasmine slept until 10 every morning. When she finally descended the stairs, she treated me worse than she treated the actual hired help. She snapped her fingers at me when she wanted a fresh cappuccino. She complained that I folded her silk blouses incorrectly. She actively paraded around the kitchen, wearing my stolen Cartier bracelet, constantly holding her wrist up to the light to admire the diamonds, while ordering me to scrub the baseboards. I swallowed every insult. I scrubbed the floors until my knees bruised. I washed their fleet of luxury cars in the freezing Chicago wind. I kept my head down and I listened. Trent was unraveling. While Jasmine paraded around acting like a billionaire's wife, Trent spent his days pacing back and forth in his home office, shouting frantically into his cell phone. His fake confidence was rapidly chipping away. Through the thin walls of the estate, I heard him screaming at his tech developers, demanding to know why they could not bypass basic encryption protocols. I heard him frantically arguing with shady financial contacts, his voice cracking with pure desperation as he realized that holding $30 million in stolen digital assets was entirely useless if he could not actually move the money into his corporate accounts. His investors were demanding proof of the angel investors' liquidity. The clock was aggressively ticking, and Trent was running completely out of time. By Thursday evening, the tension in the house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Yet my family insisted on holding another lavish dinner to maintain their facade of absolute perfection. I was not allowed to sit at the table. Vivian had instructed me to remain in the kitchen, tasked with polishing the silver serving trays and waiting on standby in case anyone required a glass refill. I stood silently by the swinging kitchen door, wiping a silver platter with a linen cloth, listening to the conversation drift from the dining room. Roland was lecturing Trent about the importance of closing the deal by Friday. "You cannot keep these investors waiting, Trent," my father said sternly, the clinking of silverware echoing through the hall. "They want to see the wire transfers. They want to see the capital injected into the startup. You promised them the angel investor was ready to move." "It is moving, Roland," Trent snapped back, his voice an octave higher than usual. The strain was painfully obvious. "These high-level international transfers take time. The protocols are complex. The capital is completely secure. It is just a matter of finalizing the routing." Jasmine chimed in, her voice oblivious and light. "Do not pressure him, Daddy. Trent is handling billions of data points right now. He is a genius." "I just want to ensure our legacy is protected," Roland grumbled. "Kendra, bring the dessert." I set the silver platter down, picked up the tray of intricately plated chocolate torts, and pushed through the swinging door. I kept my eyes lowered, serving my father first, then moving silently around the heavy mahogany table. I placed a plate in front of Trent. He was sweating. A thin sheen of perspiration coated his forehead, and his hands were trembling slightly as he reached for his water glass. He was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, completely unaware that I was the one who had built the drop. I moved to stand quietly in the corner of the room, playing the role of the invisible servant perfectly. Jasmine laughed at a joke Roland made, her stolen diamonds flashing brilliantly under the light. They were so comfortable. They were so incredibly arrogant. They thought they had entirely won. Then my phone vibrated sharply against my thigh. I slipped my hand into the deep pocket of my cheap jeans and pulled the device out, hiding the screen behind the folds of my oversized jacket. The notification was glowing brightly in the dim light of the corner. It was a highly encrypted text message from Elijah. I tapped the screen open, my heart beating in a steady, victorious rhythm. The message was brief, completely professional, and absolutely devastating. "The rat took the bait. He just reached out to our shadow brokerage. He is attempting to liquidate the stolen assets right now." I locked the screen and slid the phone back into my pocket. I looked up, staring directly at the back of Trent's head as he nervously shoved a piece of chocolate torte into his mouth. I allowed a slow, genuine smile to spread across my face. The trap had successfully snapped shut. Now it was time to burn his fake empire to the ground. I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the polished hardwood floor, murmuring a pathetic, trembling apology about needing to retrieve my remaining soot-covered clothes from my car before officially beginning my basement exile. Vivian waved me off with a dismissive, highly irritated flick of her wrist, already signaling the hired maid to clear the dessert plates. I turned and walked out of the formal dining room, my posture hunched, playing the broken, helpless daughter, right up until the heavy iron front doors of the estate clicked shut behind me. The moment the lock engaged, my spine snapped perfectly straight. The submissive, terrified mask instantly evaporated into the freezing Chicago night air. I walked briskly down the manicured driveway past the towering hedges and turned the corner onto the darkened residential street. A sleek black armored SUV sat idling silently in the shadows, its tinted windows rendering the interior completely invisible. I opened the rear passenger door and slid into the heated leather cabin. My driver, a highly discreet private security contractor named Marcus, smoothly pulled away from the curb without a single word. He reached back and handed me a freshly pressed blazer and my secondary encrypted tablet. I shed the smoke-ruined canvas jacket, tossing it onto the floorboard, and slipped my arms into the clean wool. Head downtown. I ordered, my voice dropping back to its normal authoritative pitch. Get me to Elijah's office. 30 minutes later, the SUV descended into the secure underground parking garage of a towering glass and steel high-rise overlooking the Chicago River. I bypassed the main lobby entirely, using a private executive elevator that shot straight up to the penthouse level. The polished steel doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a sprawling, ultra-modern war room. The space was dominated by floor-to-ceiling smart glass windows, aggressive abstract art, and a massive custom-built digital command center. Elijah stood at the head of a long black granite conference table. My lead corporate attorney was immaculately dressed in a charcoal bespoke suit, his eyes locked onto a rapidly scrolling stream of financial data projecting across the main wall monitor. Sitting directly across from him, looking entirely out of place in his heavy, ash-stained canvas investigator jacket, was Detective Sterling. Sterling stood up immediately as I walked into the room. He checked his heavy wristwatch, his face a mask of rugged skepticism and barely concealed impatience. "You said 3 hours, Miss Wilson." Sterling said, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "It has been exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes. You promised me a full confession, and instead your lawyer here has been showing me wire transfer protocols and talking about international cyber fraud. This is an arson investigation. I need actionable evidence, or I am leaving right now to arrest your brother-in-law based on the lighter we found at the scene." I smiled, tossing my encrypted tablet onto the granite table. "I am giving you much more than a simple arson charge, Detective. I am handing you a multi-million-dollar federal indictment completely wrapped in a bow. Please take a seat." Sterling frowned, crossing his arms over his chest, but he slowly sank back into the leather executive chair. Elijah tapped a command on his keyboard, dimming the overhead lights and clearing the financial data from the primary wall projector. Sterling had told me at the crime scene that the fire had been so intense it completely destroyed everything, including the building's central security hub. The local DVR boxes had melted into unrecognizable slag. What he did not know, and what my family could never have fathomed, was that I never relied on standard off-the-shelf security measures. I dealt in high-stakes venture capital. I handled offshore assets that made ruthless people incredibly greedy. Because of that, I operated with a level of digital paranoia that bordered on extreme. I had installed military-grade microscopic pinhole cameras flush against the custom crown molding of my home office. They were virtually invisible, hardwired into an independent battery-backed transmitter hidden inside the structural brickwork. That transmitter did not record to a local hard drive. It uploaded directly to a highly secure encrypted offshore cloud server in absolute real time. The physical cameras in my apartment were melted plastic now, but the data had permanently escaped the flames seconds as it was captured. I walked to the head of the table, standing shoulder to shoulder with Elijah. I pulled up the cloud server interface on the main screen, entering my final biometric thumbprint to bypass the firewall. "You asked how the fire started, Detective?" I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. "You asked who was in my apartment. Watch closely." I selected the video file timestamped for the exact hour the blaze originated and hit play. The massive wall monitor flickered to life. The footage was not grainy or pixelated. It was in stunning, uncorrupted 4K definition. The night vision lens cast a crisp, monochromatic glow over my pristine office, capturing the room in perfect detail long before the flames ever touched it. The digital clock in the bottom corner ticked forward in silence. Suddenly, the heavy, reinforced door of my unit swung open. Two figures slipped inside, carefully closing the door behind them. They were dressed in black tactical gear, wearing heavy boots and thick gloves. But they had made one catastrophic, monumentally arrogant error. They genuinely believed I had no internal security cameras, so they had not bothered to cover their faces. The high-definition lens captured their features with absolute damning clarity. Sterling let out a sharp, stunned breath, leaning forward and planting his hands firmly on the granite table. It was Trent, his face twisted in a mask of breathless, greedy anticipation. But he was not acting alone. Right behind him, clutching a heavy, dark canvas duffel bag, was my sister Jasmine. We watched the silent, pristine footage play out like a perfectly choreographed home invasion. Jasmine pointed frantically at the exact spot on the floorboards I had meticulously mapped out for her months ago during a carefully orchestrated conversation where I had pretended to worry about the structural integrity of my vintage flooring. She had absorbed that lie, perfectly delivering the exact coordinates directly to her husband. Trent dropped to his knees, pulling a high-powered battery-operated circular saw from the duffel bag. Though the video lacked full audio, the visual vibration and the shower of bright sparks flying across the screen made the violence of the action visceral. He tore through the historic hardwood, ripping the planks away with brutal force until he hit the titanium casing of my hidden floor safe. Jasmine bounced on her heels, her face illuminated by the ambient streetlights filtering through the window. She was literally clapping her gloved hands together in silent, uncontrollable delight. Once Trent breached the locking mechanism with a heavy pry bar, he reached deep inside the vault. He pulled out the primary velvet-lined tray. Jasmine snatched it from his hands instantly, her fingers digging violently through my private property. She pulled out the vintage Cartier tennis bracelet, holding it up to the light, mouthing a word that looked exactly like mine, before aggressively stuffing it deep into her jacket pocket. Then Trent reached back into the safe and pulled out the primary hardware wallet. He held it up like a championship trophy, a wide, triumphant grin plastered across his face. Jasmine quickly zipped the heavy duffel bag, grabbed the stacks of physical bearer bonds, and scurried out the door into the hallway, leaving Trent alone in the office to finish the job. Sterling was entirely motionless, his eyes locked onto the screen as the true severity of the crime unfolded. We watched Trent pack away his tools. He pulled two heavy industrial plastic jugs of premium camp fuel from his backpack. He uncapped them and began methodically dousing the room. He poured the accelerant deliberately over my desk across the shredded floorboards and soaked the perimeter of the room with practiced, cold-blooded efficiency. When the office was thoroughly saturated, he stepped backward into the doorway, ensuring his escape route was clear. He reached into the front pocket of his jacket and pulled out the custom silver Zippo lighter, the exact lighter I had bought him for his birthday. He flipped the lid open. He struck the flint. The camera captured the small, bright flame dancing in the darkness for a brief, incredibly arrogant moment. He smiled, admiring his own handiwork, and then casually tossed the lighter directly onto the fuel-soaked surface of my desk. The video feed whited out instantly. The room on screen erupted into a blinding, violent flash of total combustion, the inferno consuming the camera's sensors in a fraction of a second. The massive wall monitor went completely aggressively black. I tapped a key on the console, plunging the war room back into silence. I turned and looked directly at Sterling. His jaw was locked tight, his eyes wide with absolute professional disbelief. I had given him the arsonists. I had given him the grand larceny. I had given him a perfect, undeniable window into the exact moment my family tried to burn my life to the ground. The harsh glare of the wall monitor cast deep shadows across Detective Sterling's face. For a long, heavy moment, the only sound in the war room was the low hum of the ventilation system. The video of my office transforming into a blinding inferno had finished playing, leaving a static black screen in its wake. Sterling remained frozen in his leather executive chair, his eyes locked on the empty monitor, as his brain furiously processed the sheer audacity of the crime he had just witnessed. Then his professional detachment completely shattered. Sterling shot up from his chair, the heavy piece of furniture rolling backward and slamming violently into the glass wall. His face was flushed with absolute outrage. He reached instinctively for the police radio clipped to his tactical belt. He did not look at me. He looked straight through the glass doors of the penthouse, his mind already coordinating the raid. "That is grand larceny, malicious destruction of property, and felony arson." Sterling barked, his voice echoing sharply against the sleek marble floors. They just intentionally torched a historic building in a densely populated neighborhood to cover up a robbery. I am dispatching a tactical unit to that Oak Brook estate right this second. I am going to rip your brother-in-law out of his bed in handcuffs." He took 2 heavy strides toward the exit. I moved faster. I stepped directly in front of the heavy glass door, planting my feet firmly on the polished marble. I crossed my arms over my chest and blocked his path, forcing him to stop inches from my face. "No," I said, my voice completely devoid of panic, resonating with a cold, terrifying authority. "You are not calling anyone." Sterling glared down at me, his hand hovering over his radio. "Miss Wilson, I understand you are in shock, but I am a sworn officer of the law. You just showed me irrefutable video evidence of 2 upper-class criminals orchestrating a massive felony. I am arresting them right now. Move out of my way." I did not flinch. I held his furious gaze and shook my head slowly. "Detective, if you send a squad car to my parents' house tonight, you will completely ruin everything." Sterling let out a harsh breath of frustration. "Ruin what?" "We have them on camera. We have the motive. We have the stolen property in their possession. It is an open and shut case." "You do not know my family," I fired back, stepping closer to him, forcing him to listen. "If you arrest Trent tonight, the element of surprise is entirely gone. My mother will wake up, scream about police harassment, and instantly drain her entire retirement account to hire the most ruthless, expensive defense attorneys in Chicago. My father will call every judge he golfs with at the country club. They will claim the video is a deepfake. They will claim the lighter was planted. Trent will post bail before the sun comes up. And the very first thing he will do when he walks out of that precinct is panic. He will take a hammer to that hardware wallet, smash the internal drive to pieces, and melt the remaining chips in a microwave. He will destroy my entire financial empire just to eliminate the physical evidence. I cannot and will not let that happen." Sterling narrowed his eyes, his hand slowly dropping away from his radio. "So what exactly do you want to do? Let an arsonist walk free because he has rich in-laws?" "I want them obliterated," I said, pronouncing every single syllable with lethal precision. "I do not just want Trent to serve a few months in a white-collar minimum security prison while my sister continues to wear my stolen diamonds at charity galas. I want them ruined. I want them financially, socially, and legally dismantled. I want Trent to feel the exact same terror I felt standing on the freezing sidewalk, watching my life burn to ash. I want to back him into a corner so tight that he voluntarily hands the evidence over to us." Sterling stared at me, clearly unsettled by the absolute 0-degree temperature of my rage. He was a seasoned detective used to dealing with frantic victims demanding immediate justice. He was not accustomed to a victim who viewed a burning building as a mere tactical inconvenience in a much larger war. He looked over his shoulder at Elijah, who was quietly standing by the conference table, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit with a look of mild amusement. Sterling looked back at me and let out a heavy sigh, running a hand over his face. "You are playing an incredibly dangerous game, Kendra. If he destroys that drive while we wait around playing corporate espionage, you lose everything. You lose your money and I lose my arson case." "He will not destroy the drive," Elijah interrupted, his smooth, resonant voice cutting through the tension. "He is entirely too desperate to destroy his only lifeline." Elijah walked back to the head of the granite table and flipped his laptop open. He tapped a few keys, and the massive wall projector hummed back to life. The screen split into multiple windows displaying lines of encrypted code, dark web forum interfaces, and intercepted digital communication logs. Elijah gestured toward the screen with a sleek silver pen. "Detective Sterling, you are looking at this like a standard criminal investigation. You need to look at it through the lens of extreme financial desperation. Trent stole Kendra's hardware wallet, but he is fundamentally locked out. The drive requires a complex biometric signature and a randomized seed phrase. Trent fancies himself a tech genius, but his coding skills are entirely fraudulent. He cannot crack military-grade encryption, so he is sitting on a gold mine he cannot access." Sterling said finally, stepping away from the door and walking back toward the table to examine the data. "Exactly," Elijah confirmed. "But Trent has an immediate catastrophic problem. He has been lying to his venture capital investors for months. He promised them a massive liquidity injection by the end of this week. He told them he had secured a silent angel investor who was going to buy out his failing company and fund their global expansion. If Trent does not produce tens of millions of dollars in liquid cash by Friday afternoon, his investors are going straight to the Securities and Exchange Commission to file federal fraud charges against him. Trent is a drowning man looking for a raft. I walked over to the table and leaned over Elijah's shoulder, reading the intercepted communication logs. "What is he doing, Elijah? Tell me he took the bait." Elijah smiled a sharp, predatory grin that made him the most feared corporate litigator in the city. "He is doing exactly what we predicted. Since Trent cannot decrypt the wallet himself, he is actively trying to sell the encrypted physical drive on the black market. He knows the drive contains over 30 million in crypto assets. He is currently scouring the deepest corners of the dark web, offering to sell the locked drive for pennies on the dollar. He is hoping to secure a quick, untraceable cash payment of $5 million just to keep his startup afloat and keep his investors off his back." Sterling shook his head in disgust. "So he burns down a building, steals $30 million, and is now trying to fence it for $5 million just to cover his own massive business failures. The arrogance is actually staggering." "It gets so much better." Detective Elijah said, his fingers flying across his keyboard to pull up a specific encrypted chat log. Trent is terrified. He knows he cannot just walk into a bank or a standard brokerage firm with a stolen locked hardware wallet. He specifically went looking for a shadow broker. He put out a distress beacon on an anonymous forum begging for a high-net-worth buyer who operates outside the boundaries of federal regulatory oversight. He asked for a mysterious offshore billionaire who would be willing to quietly purchase stolen digital goods and immediately wire clean funds into his corporate account. I looked at the chat log on the screen. The username Trent had chosen was incredibly generic, but the digital footprint was undeniable. The messages were frantic, littered with spelling errors, practically begging the anonymous recipient to finalize the transaction immediately. Trent was promising the world, swearing that the encrypted drive held unimaginable wealth and that the transfer would be completely risk-free for the buyer. Elijah turned his laptop completely around, pushing it across the smooth granite surface, so it sat directly in front of me and Sterling. The shadow broker Trent reached out to Elijah, said, his voice dripping with pure, vicious satisfaction. "The mysterious, ruthless offshore billionaire who just agreed to purchase his stolen goods, wash the funds, and save his fake empire." Elijah tapped the spacebar, revealing the registration details of the receiving entity. The offshore account was registered in the Cayman Islands under a complex web of corporate privacy protections. But the ultimate holding company listed at the very top of the organizational chart was undeniably clear. "It is our shell company," Elijah announced, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "I set up the dummy brokerage 3 hours ago and floated the bait directly into his specific dark web channels. Trent bypassed every other buyer and came straight to us." I stared at the screen, a cold thrill of absolute victory rushing through my veins. The sheer poetic justice of the moment was almost too much to process. I looked up at Sterling, who was staring at the chat logs with his jaw slightly unhinged. "Do you understand what this means, Detective?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "Trent did not just rob me. He is currently on his knees, digitally weeping, and literally begging me to buy back my own stolen money to fund his fake company. He is about to voluntarily hand the physical evidence directly over to my attorneys." Sterling let out a low, disbelieving breath. "He is going to sign a contract admitting he possesses the stolen property." "Yes," Elijah confirmed smoothly. "I have drafted an incredibly thorough asset transfer agreement. To get his $5 million, Trent must sign a binding digital contract explicitly detailing his possession of the hardware wallet. He must also agree to a physical handover of the device to our bonded courier. The moment his pen hits that paper, he permanently waives any right to claim ignorance. We will have him locked in a contractual vice that he can never, ever escape." I turned away from the table, looking out the massive glass windows at the glittering skyline of Chicago. My parents had spent my entire life treating me like dirt on the bottom of their shoes. Jasmine had spent 30 years stealing my joy, my money, and my peace of mind. Trent had violently ripped my home apart and set it on fire simply because he believed I was too weak and too pathetic to ever fight back. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. "Tell him we accept his offer, Elijah," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the city lights. "Tell him the mysterious billionaire is thrilled to do business with him. Tell him we require the physical handover of the hardware wallet tomorrow afternoon. And tell him that the moment we have the drive in our possession, his money will be released." Elijah chuckled softly, his fingers already moving across the keyboard to draft the response. "Consider it done, Kendra. He is going to sleep very well tonight, thinking he just saved his own life." "Let him sleep," I replied, picking up my ruined soot-stained jacket from the floor. "Because tomorrow we are going to wake him up." I turned away from the sprawling, illuminated skyline of Chicago and walked back to the heavy granite conference table. The adrenaline that had spiked through my veins when we watched Trent set my office on fire was slowly morphing into a cold, hyper-focused state of absolute clarity. Detective Sterling had left the penthouse, reluctantly agreeing to hold off on his arrest warrants for exactly 48 hours. He did not like my methods, but he understood the brutal efficiency of my strategy. I did not just want Trent in handcuffs, I wanted him completely erased. Elijah remained seated at his command center, his fingers resting lightly over the keyboard. The massive wall monitor had shifted from the arson footage back to the intercepted dark web communications. The digital cursor blinked steadily in the chat window, waiting for our official response to Trent's desperate plea for a buyer. "We need to construct the bait perfectly," I said, pulling out a heavy leather chair and sitting down across from Elijah. "If we make this buyout look too easy, Trent might actually get suspicious. He is stupid, but he has the innate paranoia of a guilty man. We need to make him jump through hoops. We need to make him believe this is a highly exclusive, cutthroat institutional acquisition." Elijah nodded his eyes, reflecting the blue light of the monitors. "I am pulling the financial dossiers on his startup right now." I leaned back in the chair, letting the sheer absurdity of Trent's situation wash over me. For years, I had watched this man completely con his way through life. Trent was a walking, breathing monument to unchecked white privilege and weaponized mediocrity. He possessed absolutely no original ideas, no actual coding ability, and zero fundamental understanding of commercial software architecture. What he did possess was a sharp jawline, an expensive haircut, and the innate ability to speak confidently using meaningless Silicon Valley buzzwords. He wore Patagonia vests and talked loudly about disrupting legacy paradigms, and people simply handed him money. Chief among those gullible investors were my own parents. Roland and Vivian had been so incredibly desperate to acquire a Golden Country Club-approved son-in-law that they willingly blinded themselves to every single glaring red flag. When Trent needed seed capital for his first doomed app, Roland quietly liquidated a substantial portion of his stock portfolio to fund it. When Trent and Jasmine decided they needed a massive, historically significant estate to project the proper image of wealth, Roland covered the down payment and co-signed the mortgage. My parents practically shoveled their own wealth directly into Trent's pockets, rewarding his profound incompetence at every turn because he fit their aesthetic ideal. Meanwhile, they looked at my grueling 60-hour work weeks, my discreetly built financial empire, and my quiet, unflashy lifestyle, and they called me a pathetic failure. They worshipped a parasite while openly despising the daughter who actually possessed the ambition they claimed to value. But the facade was finally cracking. Trent was currently drowning in a massive ocean of corporate debt. The market had realized his underlying technology was a complete sham. His institutional lenders were calling in their markers. He was burning through my parents' money faster than Roland could print it, and he was absolutely terrified. That was exactly why he had sawed open my floorboards. He believed stealing my digital assets was the only way to magically generate the liquidity required to keep his fake empire from completely collapsing. "Pull up a blank corporate acquisition agreement." Elijah, I instructed, resting my elbows on the cold granite table. "We are going to draft the term sheet for his buyout, and we are going to make it the most predatory, ironclad contract you have ever written." Elijah's lips curled into a sharp, deeply predatory grin. He hit a quick combination of keys and a dense multi-page legal document materialized on the primary wall monitor. I love a hostile takeover disguised as a rescue mission. Elijah murmured, his fingers flying across the keys as he began populating the boilerplate legal headers. How deep are we burying the traps? We are burying them all the way down to the bedrock, I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. Structure this as a highly aggressive mezzanine financing agreement wrapped inside a stealth equity buyout. We will offer him exactly what he is begging for. We will offer to purchase his entire company, including the stolen intellectual property he claims to own, for a wildly inflated valuation. We will offer him an immediate, untraceable cash injection of $50 million. Elijah raised an eyebrow, pausing his typing for a fraction of a second. 50 million. That is a massive number, Kendra, even for a blind tech acquisition. It has to be massive, I countered. Trent operates purely on ego and greed. If we offer him a realistic number, he will try to negotiate. If we offer him 50 million, his brain will completely shut down. He will see the zeros, he will picture himself on the cover of Forbes, and he will completely ignore the fine print. He will sprint toward the edge of the cliff with a smile on his face. I stood up and began pacing the length of the conference room, my eyes scanning the complex legal jargon Elijah was rapidly generating on the screen. We need to lock him into a corner he can never legally escape. I continued, my mind racing through the corporate mechanisms of financial ruin. Insert an immediate cross-default clause. Tie the release of the acquisition funds directly to the successful cryptographic verification of the assets stored on that stolen hardware wallet. When he inevitably fails to provide the decryption keys, because he literally does not have my biometric thumbprint to unlock the drive, the contract will register an immediate catastrophic default. Elijah nodded in profound appreciation, highlighting a section of text and heavily modifying the indemnity clauses. Standard venture capital agreements rarely include personal liability triggers. This aggressive, he noted, his voice low and focused. If he fails to deliver the underlying intellectual property, the penalty clause activates instantly. We demand immediate full repayment of the projected buyout value plus punitive damages. But Kendra, there is a fundamental structural issue here. Elijah stopped typing and turned the laptop screen slightly toward me. To execute a legally binding default of this magnitude, we require a massive amount of secured collateral. We need assets we can legally seize the moment he breaches the contract. I have run the background financials on Trent. The man is a ghost. His house is leveraged to the absolute hilt. His luxury vehicles are all under commercial leases. His personal bank accounts are practically running on fumes. He has absolutely nothing of actual unencumbered value to pledge as collateral. If we trigger a default, he will simply declare personal bankruptcy and walk away clean. We cannot squeeze blood from a stone. I stopped pacing. I stood directly in front of the wall monitor, staring at the glowing white text of the acquisition agreement. The cold mechanical hum of the server room filled the silence. Elijah was right. Trent was completely broke. But Trent had access to something much more valuable than his own empty bank accounts. A sharp, vivid memory flashed through my mind. I was sitting at the dining room table during Thanksgiving dinner exactly 2 years ago. Roland had been drinking heavily, loudly, holding court, and bragging to his country club friends about his aggressive new estate planning strategies. He had proudly announced that he had officially bypassed me and Jasmine entirely. Instead, he had named Trent as the primary executive trustee of the family portfolio. Roland had boasted that a man of Trent's superior financial caliber was the only person capable of managing the family wealth. He had legally granted Trent comprehensive, durable power of attorney over every single commercial asset investment portfolio and liquid account belonging to my parents. Roland had voluntarily handed Trent the keys to his entire existence. I placed my hands flat on the granite table and leaned forward, looking directly into Elijah's eyes. A slow, deeply dangerous smile spread across my face. Make sure the contract states that the anonymous investor requires full unconditional collateralization of all available familial assets, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, lethal whisper. Elijah frowned, his brow furrowing in momentary confusion. Familial assets? Kendra, that is completely unorthodox. No legitimate broker would demand the assets of the extended family. We are not a legitimate broker, Elijah, I reminded him softly. We are a dark web shadow entity throwing $50 million at a desperate fraudster. We can demand whatever we want. Trent has comprehensive, durable power of attorney over my parents' entire estate. He legally controls Roland and Vivian's home, their retirement accounts, their stock portfolios, and their liquid cash. He has the absolute legal authority to pledge their entire financial existence as collateral for his own business loans. Elijah's eyes widened slightly as the sheer devastating magnitude of my strategy finally clicked into place. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly heavy. He stared at me, a profound mixture of professional awe and genuine terror registering on his face. You want him to pledge his in-law's entire life savings? Elijah said, his voice quiet. You want to see if he will legally risk your parents' home to save his own skin. I stood up straight, crossing my arms over my chest and staring at the glowing text on the monitor. My parents spent my entire life telling me that Trent was a visionary. They told me he was a good man, a brilliant mind, and the perfect son. They allowed him to sit at their dinner table while he actively plotted to rob me blind and burn my life to the ground. They told me I was the failure. I looked back down at Elijah, my eyes cold and completely unblinking. Draft the clause, Elijah. Put it directly into the final execution document. Let us find out exactly how much Trent truly values his loyal, devoted in-laws. Let us see if he is greedy enough and desperate enough to gamble their entire lives away just to secure his own fake empire. 2 days later, the heavy scent of aged leather, imported bourbon, and expensive cigar smoke hung thick in the air of the Sovereign Club. The downtown establishment was a notoriously exclusive, members-only fortress designed specifically for the city's financial elite. I was not sitting in the main VIP lounge. I was stationed in the adjacent private security suite, sitting perfectly still in a leather armchair, staring intently at a bank of high-definition surveillance monitors. A tiny, virtually invisible earpiece rested inside my right ear, providing a secure, encrypted two-way audio feed directly to Elijah. Elijah sat alone in the center of the massive mahogany table next door, looking every inch the ruthless corporate executioner. He wore a flawless, charcoal bespoke suit, his posture relaxed but commanding. His hands rested calmly over a thick black leather portfolio. The heavy oak door to the VIP lounge swung open. Trent walked in. He was practically oozing unearned confidence. He wore a sharp-tailored navy suit that I knew for a fact had maxed out his final remaining credit card. He paused just inside the doorway, his eyes quickly scanning the shadowy corners of the room, clearly searching for the mysterious, eccentric, offshore billionaire he had conjured in his own mind. When his gaze landed solely on Elijah, a brief flash of sharp disappointment crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with his signature arrogant smirk. He swaggered into the room, tossing a heavy dark canvas duffel bag directly onto the polished mahogany table. I instantly recognized the bag. It was the exact same one Jasmine had clutched in her greedy hands while looting my private safe. I assume you are the middleman, Trent said, pulling out a chair and sitting down heavily. He crossed his legs, attempting to project the relaxed dominance of a seasoned tech mogul. I was explicitly told I would be meeting with the primary investor today. I do not typically conduct high-level asset transfers with subordinates. My time is incredibly valuable. Elijah did not blink. He did not shift his weight. He simply looked at Trent with the cold, detached interest of a biologist observing a particularly unappealing insect. I am the sole authorized legal and financial proxy for the acquiring entity, Elijah replied, his voice a smooth, resonant baritone that carried absolute authority. My client values total anonymity above all else. He does not attend preliminary acquisition meetings, and he certainly does not negotiate directly with distressed sellers. You deal with me, Trent, or you do not deal at all. Trent bristled at the word, distressed, his jaw tightening slightly. I watched his vitals practically spike through the surveillance feed. He was furious at the perceived slight, but he was entirely too desperate to walk away. He forced a tight, artificial laugh, waving his hand dismissively. Distressed is a highly inaccurate term, Trent countered, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. My tech startup is on the verge of completely disrupting the decentralized finance paradigm. The market simply requires a massive liquidity injection to properly scale our operations. That is why I agreed to this meeting. I brought the encrypted drive you requested. Trent unzipped the canvas duffel bag and reached inside. He pulled out the heavy titanium-cased hardware wallet he had sawed out of my floorboards. He placed it in the center of the table, patting it affectionately, as if he had personally engineered the technology inside. There are exactly $32 million in untraceable offshore digital assets locked inside this drive. Trent boasted, his eyes gleaming with greedy anticipation. I am willing to transfer full physical possession of this hardware to your client today. In exchange, I require an immediate non-refundable cash advance of $50 million wired directly into my corporate holding account. This covers the intrinsic value of the crypto assets, plus the acquisition rights to my underlying startup infrastructure. It is a highly lucrative bargain for your client. I sat in the adjacent room, my arms crossed tightly over my chest, listening to the sheer breathtaking audacity of his pitch. Trent possessed absolutely no original ideas, no actual coding ability, and zero fundamental understanding of commercial software architecture. He was a walking monument to weaponized mediocrity. He had spent years masking his profound incompetence behind expensive haircuts and meaningless Silicon Valley buzzwords, relying entirely on my parents' money to fund his delusions. Now he was sitting in a room attempting to strong-arm a corporate shark by using my stolen money as his primary leverage. Elijah looked down at the hardware wallet, then slowly brought his gaze back up to meet Trent's eyes. He did not reach for the drive. He did not look impressed. My client is fully aware of the estimated value contained within that specific drive, Elijah stated, his tone dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. However, we are also intimately aware of its current operational status. That drive is protected by military-grade multi-signature biometric encryption. You do not possess the private keys. You do not possess the secondary seed phrases. You are currently attempting to sell a locked titanium box. Trent swallowed hard, the arrogant smirk finally slipping from his face. A thin sheen of nervous sweat appeared on his forehead. He shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, his fake confidence rapidly chipping away under Elijah's surgical scrutiny. The encryption is a minor temporary hurdle, Trent lied, his voice pitching slightly higher. My team of developers is actively working on a backdoor bypass. We will have the assets fully liquidated within the quarter. But I need the $50 million advance right now to finalize our global expansion. Your client wants this technology. He knows the strategic value I bring to the table. Elijah opened his black leather portfolio with a slow, deliberate movement. He extracted a thick stack of legal documents and placed them squarely on the table. My client does not run a charity, Trent Elijah said, sliding a silver pen across the mahogany surface. We are perfectly willing to execute the $50 million wire transfer within the hour. We are willing to completely blind fund your startup. However, we do not finance unsecured high-risk liabilities. If we are handing you $50 million in liquid capital in exchange for a currently inaccessible digital asset, we require an absolute ironclad guarantee of repayment in the event of a catastrophic default. Trent frowned, staring at the thick stack of paper. A default? What are you talking about? The assets are right there in the box. The assets are utterly useless until they are successfully decrypted, Elijah corrected sharply. The contract stipulates a rigid 90-day compliance window. If you fail to provide the functional decryption keys by the end of that period, the contract registers an immediate hostile default. You will owe my client the full $50 million advance plus aggressive punitive damages. To secure this level of capital today, we require you to pledge absolute unencumbered collateral. Trent stared at Elijah, his mind clearly racing to find an angle. He wiped his sweaty palms on the thighs of his expensive trousers. I am pledging the entire intellectual property portfolio of my startup, Trent argued, his voice carrying a shrill note of panic. The proprietary algorithms alone are valued at over $80 million. That is your collateral. I watched the surveillance monitor closely, my eyes tracking every microscopic twitch of Trent's facial muscles. He was a fraud, and he knew it. His company owned absolutely nothing of value. His algorithms were stolen open-source garbage. Elijah let out a low, deeply dismissive chuckle. He leaned back in his chair, staring at Trent with total contempt. Do not insult my intelligence, Trent. We ran a comprehensive shadow audit on your firm yesterday. You are completely drowning in commercial debt. Your institutional lenders are actively preparing to call in their markers. Your physical house is leveraged to the absolute hilt. Your luxury vehicles are leased. Your personal bank accounts are practically running on fumes. You have absolutely nothing of actual liquid value to pledge as collateral. Your intellectual property is worthless smoke and mirrors. Trent turned completely pale. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The illusion of the brilliant, untouchable tech mogul shattered into a million pathetic pieces on the floor of the VIP room. He was a cornered animal, realizing for the first time that his predator was infinitely smarter and infinitely more dangerous than he could ever comprehend. I pressed the small tactile microphone button on my security console. The time for playing with his food was over. Squeeze him, I whispered directly into Elijah's earpiece, my voice a cold mechanical command in the darkness of the monitoring suite. Tell him the deal is completely off the table. Pack up the paperwork and walk away. Elijah did not react visibly to my command, but his execution was flawless. He let out a heavy, deeply disappointed sigh. He picked up the silver pen, placed it back into his jacket pocket, and decisively slammed his leather portfolio shut. The loud snap echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. This was a profound waste of my time, Elijah said, his voice dripping with pure disgust. You are a bankrupt fraud peddling a locked box you cannot open. My client has zero interest in funding your inevitable corporate collapse. The offer is permanently withdrawn. Elijah stood up abruptly, buttoning his bespoke jacket with precise, fluid movements. He picked up his briefcase from the floor and turned his back on Trent, taking 3 long, purposeful strides toward the heavy oak exit door. I watched the monitor as sheer, unadulterated terror violently seized control of Trent's body. If Elijah walked out that door, Trent's fake empire would crash. His investors would file federal fraud charges. He would lose everything. Trent jumped to his feet, knocking his heavy leather chair backward. It crashed against the floor, but he did not even look at it. He scrambled around the edge of the mahogany table, his face twisted in absolute pathetic desperation. Wait! Trent shouted, his voice cracking loudly in the luxurious room. Wait! Do not leave, I have it! Elijah paused, resting his hand on the brass doorknob. He turned his head slowly, looking at Trent over his shoulder with an expression of supreme boredom. You have what, exactly? Trent swallowed hard, his eyes wide and feverish. He was a man standing on the edge of an abyss, deciding to pull the ripcord on the only parachute he had left. I have collateral, Trent gasped, his hands trembling wildly. Real, unencumbered, highly liquid collateral. I have full durable power of attorney over my in-laws' entire estate. I legally control their property, their retirement portfolios, and their liquid cash. I will pledge all of it. I will pledge everything they own to secure this advance right now. Elijah stopped dead in his tracks. He stood facing the heavy oak door for 3 agonizingly long seconds, allowing Trent's desperate declaration to hang in the stale, cigar smoke-filled air of the VIP room. Through the high-definition surveillance monitor, I watched the sweat bead and roll down Trent's temples. He was practically vibrating with terror, his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly his knuckles had turned completely white. Elijah slowly turned around. He let his eyes sweep over Trent, projecting a masterful blend of extreme skepticism and predatory curiosity. You are offering to collateralize third-party familial assets, Elijah asked, his voice low and dangerous. Are you entirely certain you possess the legal authority to execute that kind of transfer, Trent? My client does not deal in fraudulent pledges. If you are bluffing to buy time, I will ensure you never secure a single dime of institutional funding in this city again. I am not bluffing. Trent practically shouted, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. He scrambled to violently yank the brass zippers of his leather briefcase open. He began frantically digging through the meticulously organized compartments, tossing aside glossy startup prospectuses and fake financial projections. He pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila folder and slammed it down onto the table. First, I am pledging my own primary residence, Trent said, his hands shaking as he pulled out a copy of a property deed. It is a massive custom-built luxury estate in the northern suburbs. The market value is easily $3 million. Elijah walked slowly back to the table. He did not even bother to sit down. He leaned over, glancing at the document for less than a second, before letting out a harsh, dismissive breath. Do not waste my time, Elijah sneered. We already ran the title. You have 2 secondary mortgages on that property, and you are currently 60 days delinquent on the primary note. The equity is entirely negative. That house belongs to the bank, not to you. It is utterly worthless as collateral. Show me the power of attorney, or I am walking out that door right now. Trent swallowed audibly, his Adam's apple bobbing against the stiff collar of his shirt. He pushed the worthless deed aside and reached deeper into the manila folder. His fingers trembled as he extracted a thick stack of heavily notarized, blue-backed legal documents. I watched the monitor from the adjacent security room, my breath catching in my throat as I recognized the heavy embossed seal on the cover page. It was the exact document Roland had so proudly bragged about during Sunday dinner just a few months ago. Roland had completely bypassed me and Jasmine, claiming that standard inheritance structures were meant for the working class. He had loudly announced to his entire country club social circle that he required a man of Trent's superior financial caliber to manage his wealth. Roland and Vivian had willingly, happily signed over their entire financial autonomy to a man who possessed absolutely no moral compass. They had handed him the ultimate weapon, and now he was pointing it directly at their heads. Trent slid the thick stack of papers across the polished mahogany table. Here, Trent said, his voice breathless and frantic. Full, durable, and completely irrevocable power of attorney. It grants me absolute, unencumbered executive authority to manage, liquidate, mortgage, or transfer any and all assets belonging to Roland and Vivian Sterling. Elijah picked up the document. The room fell into a suffocating silence as he meticulously flipped through the pages, verifying the notary stamps, the signature lines, and the specific legal clauses. I watched Elijah's eyes dart back and forth across the text, ensuring there were no loopholes, no restrictive covenants that would prevent a total financial seizure. The scope of this document is remarkably comprehensive. Elijah noted, his voice deliberately neutral, though I could hear the sharp edge of absolute victory hiding beneath his professional tone. They granted you unrestricted access to their entire financial existence. They trust my financial vision. Trent boasted, a sickening wave of unearned arrogance suddenly returning to his voice, now that he felt the trap loosening. They know I am operating at a level they simply cannot comprehend. I advised them that placing their assets under my executive control was the only way to shield their wealth from heavy taxation. They signed it without reading past the first page. Elijah set the document down and leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table, bringing his face mere inches from Trent's. Let us be absolutely clear about the mechanics of this transaction, Trent, Elijah said, dropping his voice to a lethal, unforgiving whisper. If I accept this collateral, you are officially pledging the Oak Brook estate. You are pledging their entire fully funded retirement portfolio. You are pledging their liquid cash reserves, their mutual funds, and their private checking accounts. If you fail to provide the functional decryption keys for that stolen hardware wallet within 90 days, this contract triggers an immediate hostile default. My client will legally seize every single asset listed in this portfolio. Your in-laws will be evicted from their home. They will be entirely penniless. You are literally gambling their survival on your ability to crack military-grade encryption. I leaned forward in my leather chair, pressing my hands against the cool surface of the security console. I watched Trent's face closely. I waited for a flicker of hesitation. I waited for a single ounce of human decency or familial loyalty to surface. I waited to see if he possessed even a microscopic shred of guilt about rendering the people who had funded his entire lifestyle completely homeless. Trent looked down at the documents, then back up at Elijah. A slow, deeply greedy, genuinely chilling smile spread across his face. My in-laws will never know. Trent laughed, waving his hand as if waving away a minor, insignificant detail. They are old, outdated, and completely financially illiterate. They do not understand modern liquidity or aggressive leverage. This is merely a temporary bridge loan. Once I secure the $50 million, the startup goes global. When we go public next year, the valuation will be in the billions. I will buy them a brand new, bigger house. I am actually doing them a massive favor by utilizing their stagnant capital. The absolute breathtaking narcissism of his statement hung in the air. He had completely rationalized the total destruction of my parents' lives. He viewed their hard-earned wealth as his own personal piggy bank, completely detached from the reality that he was signing away the very roof over their heads. "Just give me the pen," Trent demanded, reaching his hand out across the table, his fingers twitching with naked greed. "We have a deal. Give me the $50 million. Elijah did not smile. He simply opened his black leather portfolio, extracted a thick, aggressively bound addendum to the main contract and placed it on the table. He unscrewed the cap of his silver pen and placed it precisely next to the signature line. "Sign the addendum," Elijah instructed coldly. "Initial every page detailing the pledged collateral." I watched in stunning 4K definition as Trent eagerly grabbed the silver pen. He did not read a single line of the fine print. He did not pause to consider the catastrophic, life-altering consequences of his actions. He simply flipped through the pages, his hand flying across the paper, scribbling his signature with frantic, desperate energy. He was literally signing away his family's entire existence, completely blinded by the illusion of his own impending wealth. With a final aggressive flourish, Trent signed the last page and shoved the stack of documents back across the table. "Done," Trent declared, letting out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. He slumped back into his chair, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "The power of attorney is officially attached. The collateral is locked. Now initiate the wire transfer to my corporate holding account." Elijah smoothly collected the signed documents, verifying every single signature before sliding them safely into his portfolio. He then reached out and placed his hand firmly over the titanium hardware wallet resting in the center of the table. He pulled it toward him, slipping my stolen crypto drive securely into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. "The physical asset has been received and logged," Elijah stated, snapping the portfolio shut and standing up. "The verification process will commence immediately. The funds will be released to your corporate account precisely according to the stipulations outlined in the contract you just executed." Trent frowned slightly, sensing a subtle shift in the atmosphere. "Wait, you said the transfer would be immediate." "Immediate upon cryptographic verification." Elijah corrected sharply, his tone, leaving absolutely no room for debate. "As per Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the agreement you just signed, my client must verify the volume of the assets on the drive. You have 90 days to provide the decryption keys. I highly suggest you get your development team working around the clock, Trent. The clock on your collateral has officially started ticking." Elijah turned on his heel and walked out of the VIP room, the heavy oak door clicking firmly shut behind him, leaving Trent sitting alone at the table, staring at the empty space where his stolen leverage used to be. I sat back in my chair in the security suite, letting out a long, slow breath. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had crushed him completely. Trent had voluntarily handed over the evidence of his grand larceny, legally admitted to possessing the stolen property, and pledged my parents' entire net worth as collateral for a loan he would never ever be able to repay. I reached up to remove the earpiece, preparing to pack up my equipment and head back to the basement to continue playing the broken, helpless maid. Then my phone vibrated violently against the console table. The harsh buzzing sound startled me in the quiet room. I picked up the device, the screen illuminating my face in the dim light. I expected a confirmation text from Elijah or a status update from Sterling. Instead, the caller ID flashed with a name I had not seen on my screen since the night they threw me out of their house. It was a text message from my mother, Vivian. The harsh buzzing of my phone vibrating against the console table startled me, piercing the heavy artificial silence of the club's security suite. The screen illuminated my face in the dim light, casting long shadows across the bank of surveillance monitors. I looked down, expecting a confirmation text from Elijah or a status update from Detective Sterling regarding the tactical units. Instead, the notification banner flashed with a name I had not seen on my personal device since the night they threw me out of their house. It was not a private direct message. It was a notification from the Wilson family group chat. I stared at the screen for a long, heavy moment. This group chat had been a digital wasteland for me for years. It was a channel I had been practically muted in, utilized by my mother exclusively to coordinate lavish holiday dinners I was barely invited to, or to broadcast Trent and Jasmine's entirely fictional milestones. My finger hovered over the glass. I unlocked the screen and opened the application, bracing myself for whatever performative cruelty they had decided to hurl my way today. A high-resolution photo loaded instantly at the bottom of the thread. It was a selfie of Trent. He was sitting in the driver's seat of his leased luxury German sedan. The interior ambient lighting highlighted his sharp jawline and perfectly styled hair. He was holding up a crystal flute of expensive champagne, a wide, aggressively smug smile plastered across his face. He must have literally sprinted out of the club, sprinted to his car, and popped a bottle he kept in the trunk just to document his triumphant victory. The sheer, unadulterated vanity of the image was staggering, especially considering I had just spent the last 40 minutes watching him sweat shake and practically weep in terror on the surveillance feed. Beneath the photograph was a lengthy text message from my mother, Vivian. Trent just secured a multi-million-dollar buyout. This is what a real man does. Kendra, you should swallow your pride and beg him for a job instead of playing the victim over your little fire. I read the words again, letting the absolute breathtaking callousness of that final sentence wash over me. Your little fire. My life's work, my business, my sanctuary. A historic building in downtown Chicago completely reduced to a smoking, hazardous pile of ash and completely ruined concrete. Trent had orchestrated a violent felony-level arson that could have easily resulted in mass casualties, and Vivian had effortlessly reduced it to a little fire. She was actively weaponizing the most traumatic, devastating event of my life to elevate Trent's completely fabricated success. She was demanding that I, the victim of a massive financial crime, grovel at the feet of the man who had just violently robbed me. Before I could even fully process the sheer psychological toxicity of Vivian's message, 3 small, gray typing bubbles appeared at the bottom of the screen. Jasmine was actively chiming in. A second later, her message populated the chat. Don't bother, Mom. Kendra doesn't have the wardrobe to work in his new corporate office anyway. I stared at the nail polish emoji. The absolute profound superficiality of my sister was almost comical. Her husband was currently drowning in a massive ocean of commercial debt. Their luxury estate was fundamentally owned by a syndicate of aggressive lenders, and Trent had just spent the last hour actively trying to fence stolen digital goods on the dark web. Yet Jasmine's primary concern in life remained my perceived lack of high-end corporate fashion. They were living in a beautifully constructed, entirely hollow delusion. I did not feel the familiar burning sting of rejection that used to accompany their messages. I did not feel the desperate childhood urge to defend myself, to list my accomplishments, or to beg them to finally see my worth. I felt absolutely nothing but cold surgical precision. I tapped the text field. I did not type a paragraph. I did not hurl insults or accuse Trent of arson. I simply smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile in the empty security room. I typed a single definitive response. You're absolutely right. I could never do what Trent does. I hit send. I watched the tiny word delivered appear beneath my message. Let them interpret that however their arrogant, deeply flawed minds desired. Let them believe I was finally conceding defeat. Let Vivian and Jasmine toast to their own superior status. They had absolutely no idea that I was currently staring at a surveillance monitor showing Trent driving away from a building where he had just legally signed away their entire existence. I set the phone face down on the console. The time for entertaining their digital delusions was permanently over. I reached up and tapped the hidden earpiece resting inside my right ear, opening the encrypted two-way audio channel. Elijah. I said, my voice resonating with absolute, unwavering authority. Execute the counter-signature. Drop the guillotine. I am already in the vehicle. Kendra Elijah's smooth, resonant voice crackled softly in my ear. The heavy, muffled sound of his armored town car door slamming shut echoed through the feed. I have the addendum in front of me. Through the audio link, I heard the distinct metallic click of his silver fountain pen. I heard the sharp, rhythmic scratch of ink gliding across heavy cardstock. Elijah was signing the bottom line of the acquisition agreement on behalf of Obsidian Holdings, the completely untraceable offshore shell company I had personally funded and constructed. The moment his pen lifted from the paper, the legal landscape of my family completely and violently shifted. The trap had officially snapped shut. Trent had blindly signed a binding, highly aggressive mezzanine financing agreement. He had legally pledged comprehensive collateral to secure a $50 million advance. And because he possessed an irrevocable, durable power of attorney over my parents' estate, that collateral consisted of Vivian and Roland's entire financial portfolio. The Oak Brook estate, the fully funded retirement accounts, the offshore mutual funds Roland had spent 3 decades hiding from federal tax auditors, the liquid cash reserves. Every single asset they possessed was now legally encumbered. It was all inextricably bound to Trent's ability to unlock a biometric hardware wallet he could never ever access. The moment Trent defaulted on the 90-day decryption window, Obsidian Holdings would execute an immediate hostile asset seizure. My shell company would legally foreclose on my parents' home. We would liquidate their retirement funds, we would drain their accounts. The family's entire net worth was now legally mine. It is done, Elijah confirmed over the comms, the sound of paper shuffling as he returned the executed documents to his secure portfolio. The contract is legally binding and fully active. The default timer has officially started. I am routing the physical hardware wallet to our secure biometric vault right now. No, I countered smoothly, standing up from the leather armchair and adjusting the collar of my jacket. Do not take the drive to the vault, Elijah. Secure it in a heavy evidence bag. I need you to meet me at the Federal Building downtown. There was a brief pause on the line. The Federal Building. Kendra, we have the contract. We have the collateral. We have completely neutralized Trent on a civil and corporate level. In 90 days, your parents will be entirely bankrupt. Why are we bringing federal authorities into a closed corporate loop? Because Trent did not just breach a contract, I explained, my voice echoing coldly in the empty security suite. He committed a violent felony. He burned down a historic building. He endangered lives. Civil ruin is the punishment for his arrogance, but federal prison is the punishment for his crimes. I picked up my secondary encrypted mobile phone and dialed Detective Sterling's direct line. He answered on the second ring, the loud background noise of a busy police precinct bleeding through the speaker. Tell me you have something concrete, Wilson. Sterling barked, his voice laced with heavy impatience. My captain is breathing down my neck about the arson investigation. I cannot keep stalling the warrants just because you wanted to play corporate spy games. You do not have to stall anymore. Detective, I replied, stepping out of the security suite and walking down the dimly lit carpeted hallway of the VIP club. The corporate spy games are officially concluded, and I am delivering your primary suspect on a silver platter. Sterling went completely quiet on the other end of the line. You have proof. I have much more than proof, I stated, pushing open the heavy exit doors and stepping out into the cool, sharp evening air of downtown Chicago. I have the physical stolen asset. Trent just voluntarily handed over my encrypted hardware wallet during a recorded, fully documented corporate acquisition meeting. He signed a legal addendum explicitly verifying his physical possession of the stolen drive. You have his signature, you have his motive, and you have the stolen goods. I heard Sterling let out a low, impressed whistle. He literally signed a document admitting he had the stolen property. The arrogance of these white-collar guys will never cease to amaze me. I am dispatching a tactical unit to his residence right now. We will have him in an interrogation room before midnight. Hold the tactical unit. Detective, I interrupted smoothly, walking toward the curb where a black car was already waiting for me. This is no longer just a local arson investigation. What are you talking about? Sterling demanded, his tone hardening. Arson and grand larceny fall directly under my jurisdiction. They do. I agreed, opening the heavy car door and sliding into the leather back seat. But Trent did not just steal a physical object. He transported stolen digital assets across state lines using encrypted decentralized networks. Furthermore, he explicitly utilized federal wire systems and internet protocols to actively negotiate the sale of those stolen assets to an offshore international holding company. I paused, letting the heavy, undeniable legal reality settle over the line. He just committed massive documented wire fraud. Detective, I continued, my voice carrying the lethal precision of a judge delivering a final verdict. And he did it while attempting to fence stolen cryptocurrency. That officially elevates this entire situation out of local jurisdiction and pushes it directly into the realm of federal cybercrimes. I am pulling up to the federal building right now. I am flagging the encrypted drive directly to the FBI. Sterling let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. You are not just locking him up, you are handing him over to the feds. They are going to completely dismantle his entire life. I looked out the tinted window as the car merged into the heavy Chicago traffic. I thought about Vivian's text message. I thought about Jasmine's nail polish emoji. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, and the absolute certainty they all possessed that I was nothing more than a pathetic, disposable failure. They are going to dismantle what is left of his life, I corrected softly, the city lights reflecting in my eyes. But I have already taken everything else. Saturday night arrived with the suffocating humidity typical of a southern evening. Trent had not just celebrated his fake $50 million buyout quietly. He had immediately chartered a private jet, flown the entire family and his core executive team down to Georgia, and rented out the grand ballroom of Atlanta's most exclusive, historically restrictive country club. He wanted to make a statement. He wanted to parade his newly acquired, completely fraudulent wealth in front of the city's black high society, the local politicians, and the regional venture capitalists. He was throwing himself a coronation. The driveway of the country club was a winding river of imported luxury vehicles, valet attendants sprinting back and forth under the glow of gas lanterns. I bypassed the valet stand entirely. I walked up the sweeping marble staircase of the main entrance, my footsteps heavy and deliberate. The massive crystal chandeliers in the foyer cast a brilliant, unforgiving light on my attire. I had not dressed for a gala. I was wearing the exact same clothes I had worn the night my world burned down. My jeans were smeared with gray ash. My boots were scuffed, and wrapped tightly around my shoulders was the ruined, soot-stained jacket that still smelled faintly of toxic smoke and melted plastic. The contrast between me and the sea of haute couture was jarring. Women in floor-length silk gowns and men in impeccably tailored tuxedos openly stared as I crossed the threshold. The string quartet playing softly in the corner of the lobby seemed to falter for a fraction of a second as I walked past. I had not made it 10 feet into the grand foyer before Vivian materialized out of the crowd. My mother moved with the frantic, terrified energy of a woman watching her carefully constructed social facade crumble in real time. She wore a stunning emerald green gown, her hair perfectly coiffed, but her eyes were wide with absolute panic. She physically threw herself into my path, planting her feet on the polished marble to block me from entering the main ballroom. "Are you out of your mind?" Vivian hissed, her voice a sharp, venomous whisper, designed not to carry over the ambient noise of the party. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into the ruined fabric of my jacket. "You look like a vagrant. You are embarrassing us in front of the mayor. Turn around and walk out those doors right now before Roland sees you." I did not pull my arm away. I simply looked down at her hand, then up into her panicked eyes. My gaze was completely hollow. I felt absolutely no emotional connection to the woman standing in front of me. She was a stranger desperately trying to protect a lie. Before I could formulate a response, the crowd parted slightly. Jasmine strutted over. My sister moved with a predatory, triumphant grace, relishing the attention of the room. She was wearing a custom silver sequined dress that clung to her figure, her neck and wrists absolutely dripping in diamonds. The sick, twisted knot in my stomach tightened into a hard block of ice as I looked at her right wrist. Fastened securely around her skin was my Cartier love bracelet, the specific custom-engraved piece of jewelry I had purchased to celebrate my very first $1 million contract. She had looted it from my firebombed office safe and was now wearing it as a trophy at her husband's victory party. Jasmine stopped next to our mother, looking me up and down with an expression of profound disgust. She let out a loud theatrical sigh, ensuring the horrified elite guests standing nearby could hear every single word of her performance. She opened her diamond-encrusted clutch and pulled out a crisp, newly minted $100 bill. With a flick of her wrist, she shoved the money directly into the center of my chest. It fluttered for a second before I instinctively caught it against my soot-stained jacket. "Go to a motel and buy yourself a new dress, sweetie," Jasmine said, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "My treat. Let the successful people celebrate." The surrounding guests let out a collective muted gasp. A few people turned away, deeply uncomfortable with the raw, humiliating familial display. Vivian stood up straighter, clearly emboldened by Jasmine's absolute dismissal of my presence. They both looked at me, fully expecting me to shatter. They expected the tears. They expected me to drop my head in shame, turn around, and flee into the humid Atlanta night. They expected the broken, pathetic victim they had spent their entire lives conditioning me to be. I did not cry. I did not yell. I did not let a single ounce of their toxic energy penetrate my armor. I looked down at the crisp bill in my hand. I smoothed the edges with slow, deliberate precision. I folded the money exactly in half, then in quarters, creasing the paper with my thumbnail until it was a tight, compact square. I slipped the folded bill securely into the front pocket of my ruined jacket. I looked up, meeting Jasmine's smug gaze with a smile that was so entirely devoid of warmth, it caused her expression to falter. "Thank you, Jasmine," I said, my voice resonating with a terrifying absolute calm. "But I am not here to eat. I am here to give a toast." I stepped forward. I did not wait for their permission. I dropped my shoulders slightly and pushed right past them. Vivian let out a sharp gasp of outrage, reaching for me again, but I was already moving. Across the room, Roland was standing near the entrance of the main ballroom, holding a snifter of champagne and speaking with a group of local politicians. I saw the exact second he spotted me. His face went completely pale. He immediately began signaling to the private security guards flanking the heavy mahogany doors, gesturing frantically toward me. Two massive men in dark suits stepped forward to intercept my path. I did not break my stride. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead, walking with a lethal, unyielding momentum. As the first guard reached out to grab my shoulder, I simply turned my head and looked at him. I did not speak. I just held his gaze with a look of such absolute, concentrated authority that he instinctively hesitated. In that singular fraction of a second, I sidestepped. His reaching hand slipped seamlessly between him and his partner and pushed through the heavy mahogany doors into the grand ballroom. The space was breathtaking. It was a cavernous, gilded room packed with hundreds of the wealthiest individuals in the region. Waitstaff carried silver trays of caviar and champagne. A 12-piece jazz band occupied the massive stage at the far end of the room, playing a lively, upbeat tempo that filled the air with celebratory energy. And right in the center of the room, surrounded by an adoring crowd, stood Trent. He was holding a microphone, clearly preparing to give his own victory speech. I walked straight down the center aisle. The crowd naturally parted for me. The visual shock of a woman in a soot-stained, ruined jacket striding aggressively through a sea of tuxedos created a ripple effect of stunned silence. I felt the physical weight of hundreds of eyes tracking my every movement, but my focus was entirely locked on the stage. Trent saw me approaching. His arrogant smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. He lowered his microphone, staring at me as if I were an apparition. I reached the stage. I gripped the brass handrail and walked up the short flight of stairs, my heavy boots thudding against the polished wood. I walked directly up to the microphone stand positioned at the center of the platform. The lead singer of the jazz band stepped back, her eyes wide with alarm. I reached out and tapped the steel grill of the microphone with my index finger. The sharp, echoing thump reverberated through the massive sound system. I grabbed the microphone stand and pulled it an inch toward me. A loud, piercing screech of audio feedback ripped through the ballroom. The jazz band abruptly stopped playing. The lively music died instantly. The entire ballroom of elites fell dead silent. The only sound left in the cavernous space was the low hum of the ventilation system and the clinking of a single glass being set down on a table somewhere in the back. I stood at the edge of the stage, the bright spotlights blindingly hot against my face. I looked down into the crowd. I saw Roland and Vivian pushing their way to the front, their faces masks of pure horror. I saw Jasmine standing frozen, her hand clutching the diamonds at her throat. And I saw Trent standing less than 20 feet away from me, his eyes darting nervously toward the exits. I leaned into the microphone. "My brother-in-law Trent claims a brilliant silent investor saved his company today," I said smoothly. My voice echoed across the massive room, completely steady, completely devoid of the panic they all desperately wanted to see. "He claims he secured a $50 million buyout. He flew you all here tonight to celebrate his absolute genius, his unparalleled business acumen, and his flawless reputation." I paused, letting the silence stretch until it became physically uncomfortable. Trent took a half-step backward, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "But Trent forgot to mention the actual cost of doing business." I continued, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that captivated the entire room. "He forgot to mention that the collateral he legally pledged for that massive buyout was not his own. He forgot to mention the arson. He forgot to mention the theft. And most importantly, he forgot to mention that the brilliant silent investor who now legally owns every single asset his family possesses is me." A collective wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd. Trent opened his mouth to shout, his face flushing a violent, panicked shade of crimson. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the banquet hall burst open with a deafening crash. The crowd spun around. Detective Sterling, flanked by 4 heavily armed uniformed police officers, strode aggressively into the room. Their tactical gear and radio chatter completely shattered the elegant, curated atmosphere of the gala. Sterling did not pause. He marched straight down the center aisle, his eyes locked entirely on Trent. The wealthy elite scattered out of his path like frightened birds. The trap was sprung, the evidence was logged, and the illusion was permanently over. Vivian let out a sharp, breathless laugh of relief the moment she saw the tactical uniforms breaching the grand ballroom. Her panicked posture instantly relaxed, replaced by the smug, arrogant certainty she had wielded like a weapon my entire life. She leaned heavily against Roland, pointing a perfectly manicured finger in my direction. She did not even bother to lower her voice. "Good," Vivian announced, her words carrying easily over the sudden, terrified silence of the crowd. "Trent called the police to have her removed. It is about time someone hauled her out of here. She has lost her mind." I did not look at her. I kept my eyes locked on Detective Sterling as he marched down the center aisle. He bypassed the terrified waiters. He bypassed the mayor who was flattening himself against a pillar to get out of the way. He marched straight past Vivian and Roland. He marched straight past me. He did not even glance in my direction. He walked directly up to the edge of the stage, stopping just below the platform where Trent stood frozen. Trent stared down at the officers, the microphone slipping slightly in his sweaty palm. A confused, indignant scowl twisted his features. He genuinely believed his new fabricated wealth made him entirely untouchable by local law enforcement. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project the authority of a corporate titan. Officer Trent demanded, his voice echoing loudly through the sound system. "I am the host of this private gala. I want that woman in the ruined jacket arrested for trespassing and harassment immediately." Before Sterling could even reach for his handcuffs or read Trent his rights, I reached into the deep pocket of my soot-stained jacket. My fingers wrapped around the small, smooth plastic of the remote control Elijah had engineered for me. The country club's audio-visual system had been ridiculously easy to hijack. I pulled the remote out, pointing it directly at the massive wall-to-wall LED screens suspended behind the stage. Those screens had been looping Trent's sleek, meaningless startup logo all night. I pressed the red button. The screens flickered wildly. A loud electronic buzz ripped through the ballroom speakers, causing several guests to cover their ears. The digital logo shattered into static, instantly replaced by the crystal-clear 4K resolution of my hidden cloud security footage. The entire ballroom fell into a horrified, absolute silence. 50 feet wide and 30 feet tall, the indisputable reality of my family's betrayal played out in brilliant color for Atlanta's elite to witness. The video showed the pristine interior of my private office. It showed the heavy oak door splintering open. It showed Trent dressed in dark clothing violently swinging a steel crowbar into my custom floorboards. The high-definition audio captured the sickening crunch of the wood and Trent's heavy, desperate panting as he ripped my titanium hardware wallet from its hidden safe. A collective gasp echoed through the crowd. I saw a prominent venture capitalist drop his champagne flute. The glass shattered against the marble floor, but nobody looked away from the screens. The footage seamlessly transitioned to the next camera angle. There was Jasmine wearing the exact same smug expression she had worn 5 minutes ago in the foyer. The screen magnified her face as she greedily ripped open my velvet jewelry boxes. The entire ballroom watched in stunned revulsion as Jasmine stuffed my custom Cartier bracelet, the very same bracelet currently glittering on her wrist, directly into her designer bag. Then came the finale. The footage switched to the wide-angle lens covering the entire office. The crowd watched Trent unscrew the cap of a red plastic canister. They watched him pour gasoline over my desk, my files and my servers. They watched the flash of his silver lighter. They watched my entire life explode into a blinding, violent inferno. The visual evidence was completely irrefutable. It was a digital execution. Jasmine let out a blood-curdling shriek. She threw her hands over her face, desperately trying to hide from the burning glare of the massive screens and the hundreds of disgusted eyes suddenly turning toward her. She stumbled backward, tripping over the hem of her silver sequined dress and crashing into a cocktail table. Trent completely lost his mind. The final shred of his fake corporate persona evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, cornered criminal. He dropped the microphone. It hit the wooden stage with a loud thud, rolling toward the edge. He pointed a shaking finger down at Detective Sterling, his voice breaking into a hysterical, high-pitched shout. "You cannot arrest me!" Trent screamed, backing away toward the rear curtains of the stage. "This is a setup. It is a deepfake. You cannot touch me. I am a millionaire. My investor will destroy you. I have lawyers who will tie this precinct up for decades." I calmly walked forward, picking up the microphone Trent had dropped. I stood at the edge of the stage, looking down at the man who had tried to erase my existence. "About that investor, Trent," I said smoothly. My voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers, rolling over the stunned crowd like thunder. I did not raise my pitch. I did not yell. The absolute freezing calm of my delivery paralyzed the room. I turned my head, slightly locking eyes with Vivian and Roland, who were standing frozen near the front row, their faces entirely drained of blood. I raised my left hand, giving a subtle two-finger signal toward the back of the ballroom. The crowd parted one final time. Elijah stepped out from the shadows near the entrance. He moved with the lethal, silent grace of a predator, his charcoal suit impeccably tailored. He held a thick, perfectly bound stack of legal documents in his hands. He walked methodically down the aisle, ignoring the whispers of the elite guests. He did not approach the stage. He walked directly up to my parents. With a sharp, fluid motion, Elijah thrust the heavy, blue-backed contracts directly into Roland's hands. Roland took them instinctively, his hands trembling so violently the pages rustled in the quiet room. I leaned closer to the microphone, making sure my voice reached the very back of the hall. The silent billionaire who bought Trent's stolen goods was me, I announced, pronouncing every single syllable with devastating clarity. I set up the offshore shell company. I drafted the mezzanine financing agreement. I offered him $50 million for a locked titanium box he could not open. I watched Trent's knees physically buckle. He grabbed the microphone stand to keep himself from collapsing onto the stage, his mouth opening and closing as the sheer horrific reality of his situation finally crushed him. And the collateral he used to secure the deal, I continued shifting my gaze back to my parents. I watched Roland's eyes frantically scan the first page of the contract, reading his own signature forged by his trusted son-in-law. The collateral he pledged was your house, your cars, your entire retirement portfolio. The color completely drained from Roland's face. He let out a strange, strangled gasp, clutching his chest as if he had been shot. The heavy legal documents slipped from his fingers, scattering across the polished marble floor. Vivian stared at the papers, her mind desperately trying to reject the truth. Trent had legally utilized the comprehensive power of attorney they had foolishly granted him. He had pledged their entire net worth to a dark web entity that I controlled. Vivian dropped to her knees, her expensive emerald gown pooled around her on the floor. She scrambled forward, her manicured hands clutching at the scattered pages of the contract, her eyes wide with total consuming panic. She looked up at me, standing on the stage, the reality of her total destitution finally breaking through decades of arrogance. She was completely broke. "Kendra, please!" Vivian cried, her voice echoing shrilly in the silent ballroom. She reached a shaking hand out toward me, tears ruining her perfect makeup. "We are your family. You cannot do this. You cannot leave us on the street." I stood completely still. I looked down at the woman who had called me a failure, who had mocked my work, who had literally told me to beg for a job from the man who set my life on fire. I looked at Roland, who was leaning against a pillar, weeping openly. I looked at Jasmine, sobbing on the floor, frantically trying to unclasp the stolen Cartier bracelet from her wrist. I brought the microphone to my lips. I looked dead into Vivian's eyes, and I gave them back the exact same grace they had given me. "Not my problem," I said, my voice ringing with total uncompromising finality. "You should have been more careful. Figure it out. I am not an ATM." I dropped the microphone. It hit the stage with a sharp electronic crack that signaled the definitive end of their reign. Detective Sterling did not hesitate another second. He vaulted onto the stage, grabbing Trent by the back of his expensive suit jacket and slamming him against the wall. The sound of metal ratcheting shut echoed loudly as Sterling cuffed him. Two other officers hauled a hysterically sobbing Jasmine off the floor, binding her wrists behind her back. I did not stay to watch them read the Miranda rights. I turned my back on the stage, on the ruin of my family, and on the elite crowd that was now whispering frantically, completely horrified by the absolute destruction they had just witnessed. I walked down the center aisle, my heavy boots stepping over the scattered pages of Roland's financial ruin. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody even breathed in my direction. I pushed through the heavy front doors of the country club and stepped out into the warm Atlanta night. The air tasted clean. My chauffeur was standing by the open door of my black Maybach, his posture perfectly straight. I slid into the leather back seat, the soundproof doors sealing away the chaos inside the club. As the engine purred to life, my secondary encrypted phone began to ring. I pulled it from my pocket. It was a secure line. My lead developer was calling to confirm the closing of our next multi-million-dollar infrastructure contract. I answered the call, my voice steady, my mind sharp. I was completely unapologetic. I was entirely untouchable. I was finally truly free. The ultimate lesson here is that blood does not automatically make someone family. True family is built on mutual respect, not conditional love or financial manipulation. For years, you might shrink yourself to fit into a toxic narrative, believing that if you just try harder, they will finally see your worth. But you cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. True power comes from walking away and building your success in complete silence. Sometimes the most devastating form of justice is simply thriving without them allowing their own unchecked greed and arrogance to orchestrate their final downfall. If you have ever had to cut off toxic relatives to protect your peace, share your story in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe for more empowering journeys of survival.